The proceeding will start shortly. The proceeding will start shortly.
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, no, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
We now come to the question of Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Paula Barker.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The budget is a fantastic boost for Northern Ireland as we support the Executive to deliver on the public's priorities, providing substantial investment for Northern Ireland's economy with an additional $216 million in 2020-21. The economy will benefit from the announcements on tax cuts, including an increase to national insurance thresholds and the employment allowance. We have obviously also, since the budget, had yesterday's announcement, which will result in an additional $640 million for the Northern Ireland Executive, taking the total COVID-19 related Barnett consequentials to over $900 million.
Paula Barker.
Mr. Speaker, Northern Ireland has the highest prevalence of mental illness in the UK. The Government pledged money to Northern Ireland during the confidence and supply arrangement that was to address these challenges, but this money has not materialised. Can he tell us what discussions he's had with the Chancellor in relation to this funding and if the Government intends to keep its promise?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady makes a very important point. We all want to see good support for mental health and want to see people with mental health issues getting the right support, the right health care. We've got a very substantial, as I've just outlined, budget for the Northern Ireland Executive, and I hope we will be able to see a really good supply. I spoke myself to the Health Minister yesterday about COVID-19, but this is one of the issues we will continue to be in conversation about.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Secretary of State that we know now the link between health and the economy is automatic because of the coronavirus situation. If I had been asking him a question about health in Northern Ireland 2 weeks ago, I would have pointed out that there's a £600 million shortfall in the health budget for Northern Ireland to bring it up to speed. How much money exactly is now going to be put in to make sure that health is robust, both against the coronavirus and also to build up the capacity that it ought to have to catch up the rest of the UK?
Well, one of the things I think the Honourable Gentleman will know is that the Northern Ireland Executive, one of their key focuses is on how we improve and how they improve the health support for people across Northern Ireland. Obviously, quite rightly, the focus of everybody at the moment is primarily not just on the wider health issues, but the specific issues of dealing with coronavirus. That's something the Executive has been hugely focused on, both the Deputy First Minister, the First Minister and the Health Minister, all of whom I spoke to yesterday. That's where the focus is. There is a substantial budget there as part of the New Decade, New Approach deal. There's £2 billion of support for the Northern Ireland Executive, and I hope that we will see a really improved health service as we go forward for the people of Northern Ireland.
Tony Lloyd.
Thanks again, Mr. Speaker. But I've got to say to the Secretary of State, really, he's got to do better than this. The amount of money that's being put in around coronavirus, around health generally, is not enough for the needs of the people of Northern Ireland. What I need to ask him now, though, is that when we look at the wider monies that will be available, will that guarantee that those who can't get sick pay, those who can't pay the rent, those whose small businesses are under pressure, will this government guarantee that the support will be there, that they will still be in business when we get through this crisis?
Well, I would just gently say to the honourable gentleman, there's £2 billion of money for linked to the New Decade New Approach deal. There's obviously the budget announcements last week, the 900 million, as I've said, for the coronavirus. That's a substantial amount of money for Northern Ireland on top of the money that the executive already have. And as I say, I share with him a desire to see the executive delivering strong and good health care for Northern Ireland, and that's something we will work with the Northern Ireland executive on.
Teresa Villas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I appeal to the Secretary of State in his work with the executive on the budget and the economy to have a strong focus on farming? It's at difficult times like this that people really realise fully the importance of food security to our nation and to every family and household in this country, and we need to make sure we look after our farmers in Northern Ireland and across the whole United Kingdom.
Well done.
My right honourable friend, with her huge experience in this area, is absolutely right, both in terms of the United Kingdom and particularly in Northern Ireland. I had a round-table conversation with people in the agricultural sector very recently, in the last week or two, looking at what we do to make sure that they are able to be successful both now and as we leave. Go through the process of leaving the European Union, because that food security is important for the United Kingdom, and the agricultural sector is hugely important in Northern Ireland, and I want to continue to work with them to make sure that that is successful going forward.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is right to highlight some of the positive announcements, not only in the budget last week, but some of the emergency measures yesterday. But does he accept that it was a huge missed opportunity not to mention anything in relation to air passenger duty last week? And knowing that the Chancellor said last night he is going to engage with the Transport Secretary imminently about what we can do to protect the aviation industry. The loss of Flybe was hugely significant to regional connectivity, and this government is going to have to move on air passenger duty in the weeks to come.
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman that he's absolutely right about the challenges we want to, and we're very focused on ensuring we continue the connectivity. It's a hugely important issue for us, and it's good to see some of those routes already that Flybe have vacated being picked up by organisations like Logan and Eastern, and hopefully others as we go forward. This is a particularly difficult time for the airline industry with the coronavirus, and that's why the Chancellor and the Transport Secretary have focused on that. I've spoken to the Transport Secretary, who's very acutely aware of ensuring that we keep strong connectivity. I would just say to the honourable gentleman, he's not entirely correct. The budget did outline that there is work and a consultation piece of work around APD that the Treasury are taking forward. I understand that the people's determination to see that deliver. That's something that the Chancellor is very aware of. But as I say, we've got that work to do, and we are very alert to and will continue pressing on the importance of connectivity between GB and Northern Ireland.
Dr. Andrew Morris.
Northern Ireland economy is much more heavily based around the public sector than other parts of the United Kingdom, and COVID-19 may make that even more acute. What further fiscal measures can be taken anticipating a post-coronavirus future to ensure that we redress that balance and make the Northern Ireland economy far more self-sufficient than it currently is?
My honourable friend makes a very important point. There are, despite the challenges we all face internationally and here in the UK with coronavirus, there's some really good opportunities in the wider economy for Northern Ireland. He's quite right about that differential between private and public sector. That's one of the reasons why we have put such substantial support into the city and growth deals, which offer huge opportunity for economic growth in Northern Ireland and job creation through the private sector. Obviously, we've got a very substantial package that the Chancellor announced last night that's got some very important and large numbers, as I outlined. That's circa 900 million for Northern Ireland, and I will repeat the point that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have made, is for the benefit of the United Kingdom we will do whatever it takes.
Tobias Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to catch your eye on this issue of air passenger duty, and I reiterate the concerns on the stresses on small airports and regional airports such as Belfast. This links what goes on in Belfast with Southampton and Bournemouth. I know the Secretary of State is very alive to this. If he could have conversations with the Transport Secretary and find out when the review on air passenger duty will be brought forward. Thank you.
Well, I can assure my honourable friend the conversation between myself and the Transport Secretary and with the Chancellor on this issue will be ongoing. They are current. We are very, very focused on ensuring good connectivity around the whole of the United Kingdom. I appreciate, obviously, Eastern Airlines is an important airline in terms of connectivity around various regions. We've got a number of other airlines who are looking at picking up those, as I said, those routes for Belfast. We've also obviously got to make sure that we've got good connectivity with Derry and London Derry and other places around the whole of the United Kingdom. That's something we will be looking to deal with as quickly as we can, despite the challenges of coronavirus, which will make this a very difficult time for the airline industry, as per the comments that the Chancellor made last night.
Another do, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Northern Ireland is renowned for bus manufacturing, including Wrightbus's new Routemaster hybrid model, which is famously operating around London today, and I know that new owners are pioneering hydrogen technology. As part of the New Decade New Approach, the UK Government is providing £50 million to support the rollout of ultra-low emission public transport in Northern Ireland, and I have no doubt that Northern Ireland manufacturers will continue to lead the way in developing these next-generation buses.
John Speller.
Can I thank the Minister for that reply? And it is very welcome that money is going to electric buses and indeed to ultra-low emission buses, including hydrogen. But when I contacted my local bus company, National Express, well, they confirmed that the 29 vehicles already ordered are being built in Britain. They wouldn't commit for future orders. They went on to express a hope that capacity would grow with demand, not just from them, but from other operators. So isn't there a real role for government here? And will the Minister push for a whole-of-government and industry approach to ensure that cash flowing into electric and low-emission buses benefits bus builders in the United Kingdom, including Wrights in Ballymena?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman makes a very good point. As he will know, the Prime Minister has announced new funding to overhaul bus links in England and made a commitment to at least 4,000 new zero-emission buses. We want to work with the industry to make sure that those buses are flowing through to orders to all of those UK companies, including, as he says, Wrights in Ballymena.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree wholeheartedly with the question that has just been asked. In terms of an immediate strategy for bus builders and for bus operators, the Government could underwrite Transport for London, Birmingham Bus, TransLink, National Express, encourage them to make the orders that they've already indicated they wish to make over the next year, and put at least 100 million liquidity into manufacturing in Northern Ireland and across the UK overnight. It would cost the taxpayer nothing. They're paying for this anyway, and it would allow manufacturers to continue and people employed to have surety of employment and put bread on the table. I'd urge the Government to adopt that strategy immediately.
Well, I always listen carefully to representations from the honourable gentleman. I'm very happy to discuss that with colleagues at the Department for Transport. Further details about the detail are being developed alongside our national bus strategy, which we expect to publish later this year. But I absolutely understand the importance of the issues he raises, and as I say, I'm happy to undertake that discussion.
Alex Cunningham.
Three, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government is committed to engagement with the business community in Northern Ireland in relation to the protocol and our future trading arrangements with the EU. I've already had the opportunity to engage with a range of business representatives in Northern Ireland in recent weeks, and I look forward to continuing positive and constructive discussions in the months and weeks ahead.
Alex Cunningham.
For that answer, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State says there will be no border down the Irish Sea or across the island of Ireland. The fact the Government is intent on diverging from existing standards, however, means that checks of some sort will have to take place in Northern Ireland. What kind of checks does he think will be necessary? And on the basis that there will be very real barriers to trade, will he take personal responsibility for the ensuing mess?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman should have more faith in our ability as a country to be able to deal with technical matters. We are considering the best way to ensure that we implement the protocol, and we'll be discussing that with the EU in the Joint Committee and specialised committee created under withdrawal agreement, which meets for the first time very, very soon. But we are clear, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and we will have unfettered access.
Robert Goodwill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure we'd all wish to give our best wishes to the honourable member for North Dorset, the chair of the Northern Ireland Select Committee, who's making good progress following hip surgery, and I hope I won't have to deputise him for much longer. Could I ask the Secretary of State what discussions he's had with those involved in the Loch Ness eel fishery who are facing the triple challenges of an uncertain trading future with the European Union, with the effect that the coronavirus is having on their important markets in Belgium and Holland, and also possible redesignation of the European eel under CITES regulations once we've left the European Union.
Well, thank honourable friend. I'd like to add my good wishes to our honourable friend who is recuperating. I've been in contact with this morning. He continues to take a keen interest in the issues of Northern Ireland, understandably. These are unprecedented and challenging times for many sectors. The Chancellor has announced a package of support for business and has indicated further measures if required in the coming days. With regards to the specific group that my honourable friend has mentioned, I will raise this issue with my counterpart, the Secretary of State at DEFRA, and I can assure him that my honourable friend, the Minister, the Member for Worcester, has been dealing with this and has met with this group recently, and we will continue to take that forward.
Wilson. Speaker, in a recent visit to Belfast, EU officials and Michel Barnier made it quite clear to the business community that, first of all, they expected a hard border in the Irish Sea, and secondly, they expected the government to start implementing the things which need to be done to put that in place. Would he give us an assurance that, given that the government has a different interpretation of the withdrawal agreement than the EU has, that no steps will be taken to put either a physical, administrative or electronic border on the Irish Sea which would disrupt trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes an important point. I'm very happy to be very, very clear about this. We are determined to deliver on the agreements that are not only within the protocol but within the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, so we ensure that there is obviously no border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and there will be no border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. There will be no hard border in the Irish Sea.
Dame Diana Jones.
Before, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government has been engaging on this issue with the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, who are contracted to provide the booking services for women travelling to England to access abortion services. Flights have been rebooked for anyone affected by the collapse of Flybe to ensure access for women and girls. The Government is continuing to fund all the costs of the procedure, including travel and, where needed, accommodation. We're also working closely with the devolved administrations, with the DfT and airlines, to identify opportunities and encourage them to act quickly to fill routes which are vital for local communities and business. And as my right honourable friend mentioned earlier, a number of routes have already been taken up.
Dame Diana Jones.
Thank the Minister for that answer, but of course abortion was decriminalised in October 2019, and we now see the lost opportunity of this medical procedure not being prescribed over the last 6 months in Northern Ireland, and the failure to do so now means that we're in a much more difficult position with COVID-19. And I wondered if the Minister has given any more thought to what other action he could take to make sure that services are available to women in Northern Ireland.
Well, I say to the Honourable Lady, the Government is under a clear duty to deliver abortion reform for Northern Ireland consistent with Section 9 of the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Act, which require evidence-based protocols are adopted in terms of provision of services in Northern Ireland. Those regulations will be laid, and the deadline for that is the end of this month.
Jeffrey Donnells.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the current circumstances, the priority of my party is to protect human life, including that of the unborn child. The Minister will be aware of concerns that my party has expressed, including the First Minister, about the decision to press on with regulations on abortion in Northern Ireland, despite the Assembly being restored and this being a clear breach of the devolution settlement. Will the Minister heed the calls from Northern Ireland politicians for this matter to be dealt with by the Assembly, not by this Parliament?
Well, I recognise the very strong views on all sides on this issue, and I recognise also the constitutional challenge of what we have here. But it was clearly set by this Parliament for deadlines within which we had to act, and it was clear that if the Assembly was not in place by the deadline in October, the Government would be under a legal obligation to lay these regulations by March, and that is the obligation under which we are acting.
We now come to Wendy Chamberlain.
Question 5, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Northern Ireland is in and remains part of the United Kingdom's custom territory. The protocol itself makes that clear. It ensures unfettered market access for goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, and the arrangements we introduce will reflect this. We'll be discussing, as I said earlier on, the implementation of the protocol with the EU at the Joint Committee later this month.
Sure. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a time when many people have sadly been thrown into a state of economic turmoil, it's incredibly important that wherever the government can eliminate economic uncertainty, it does so. And there's no area more unclouded by uncertainty than the Irish border and its regulatory future as a result of our departure from the EU. So given that the government has committed to doing whatever it takes, can he commit to remove that uncertainty by extending the transition period for Brexit by 1 year?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think anybody around the United Kingdom will thank us for looking to extend the period. We had an election that was very clear about our mandate to deliver on leaving the European Union, to deliver on that manifesto pledge. We are determined to do that. The certainty we can give business is that the Northern Ireland will be and is and will always remain part of the United Kingdom customs territory and will have unfettered access.
Ben Everett. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I would answer questions 6 and 10 together. The Government has made clear on many occasions that we will never be neutral in expressing our support for the Union. I believe the UK Government, working with a restored executive to continue making Northern Ireland a great place to live, work and do business, is one of the best ways we can strengthen its place in the Union. As part of the Union, Northern Ireland benefits from being part of the world's 6th largest economy, and that allows for pooling of risks and the sharing of resources to fund public spending, such as defence, education and our National Health Service. Ben Everett.
These are unprecedented times, Mr. Speaker, and our union is incredibly precious to us. I'm sure the Minister will join me in welcoming the additional powerful support, financial support from our friend the Chancellor for Northern Ireland from the UK Government in order to deal with COVID-19.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. He's absolutely right. There is a very strong package of measures to support our UK economy at a very difficult time. The Chancellor has said the Government will do whatever it takes. And yesterday's announcement, as we discussed in the adjournment debate last night, will result in an additional £640 million from the Northern Ireland Executive, taking the total COVID-19 related Barnett consequentials to over £900 million.
Mary Robbins.
Mr. Speaker, in the absence of a functioning devolved government in Northern Ireland, the Executive Formation Act 2019 made it a legal requirement for the UK Government to implement an abortion framework before the end of March this year. The Government's yet to respond to the consultation it set up to inform the framework. However, in the spirit of devolution, does my honourable friend agree that now the Northern Ireland Executive is up and running, this should rightly be a matter for their devolved representatives?
The Government understands the strength of feeling on this issue, and we've always been clear that the best way to bring forward reform in this area would have been for the Executive and Assembly to take this forward in the best interests of Northern Ireland. However, the Government is under a clear legal duty, which this House put on it, to make regulations that provide lawful access to abortion services in Northern Ireland by the 31st of March 2020. To comply with this legal requirement, we will shortly be laying regulations in Parliament. It will be a matter for the Department of Health in Northern Ireland to commission those new services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister, I know, will agree with me that underlying the strength of Northern Ireland is a commitment to the Good Friday Agreement, a commitment to the Storm and House Agreement. This morning, the Secretary of State has made a statement about legacy. That seems to override the need for five-party consultation on this matter. It seems to override the need for cooperation between the governments here in London and in Dublin. When will the Secretary of State come to this House so he can be questioned on this matter of enormous importance to the future, if you want, of the Union, certainly to stability in Northern Ireland?
I'd say to the right honourable gentleman that our commitment to the Good Friday Agreement and its successors is absolutely intact and 100%. And the Secretary of State, of course, is answering questions in the House today. But it's also clear that the first step we are taking on this is to engage with the parties and indeed with the Irish Government. And that is actually clear from the written statement that the Secretary of State has published.
Question 7, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Government is committed to prioritising the environment. As a world leader in tackling climate change, we are the first major economy in the world to legislate for net zero. Following the restoration of the Northern Ireland Executive, Northern Ireland ministers have been in contact with executive ministers on a range of issues. The Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, which leads on environmental issues in Northern Ireland, has recently sought views on an environment strategy for Northern Ireland. And a summary of their findings, I understand, will be published in spring of this year.
In its submission to the consultation, Sustrand said it is unacceptable that there is no specific climate change legislation in Northern Ireland which would allow specific policies to be developed to meet emissions targets and to adapt to risk. Given the close connectedness of the climate emergency and the natural environment emergency, isn't it time that Northern Ireland was able to legislate so that it could develop its own climate strategy?
The Honourable Lady raises an important point, and we want to work closely with the Northern Ireland Executive on this issue. Clearly, these are devolved issues, and I think their response to the consultation on environment strategy will be key to addressing that question.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions and 9 together. We continue to consider the best way forward to implement the protocol, and I will be discussing this with the EU in the joint committee and specialised committees. And yes, I am in frequent contact with the Prime Minister as we prepare for these meetings.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, it was extensively reported that the Prime Minister had ordered his officials to, and I quote, "get round the Northern Ireland Protocol." Now, accept that his government has said it will comply with its obligations, and rightly so. So can you tell the House if the Prime Minister said these words or anything remotely like them?
Well, like I say to the Honourable Gentleman, I always find it best not to take as everything, whatever rumours you may pick up in any newspaper article. What you can take is what we've said at the dispatch box, what we've said as a government. There will be unfettered access between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom's customs territory.
Anne McLaughlin.
Mr. Speaker, what discussions and consultations has the Secretary of State had with the new Northern Ireland Executive on this protocol, and what specific, with the emphasis on the word specific, input will they have on its implementation?
Well, obviously I am talking to the Northern Ireland Executive on a regular basis, particularly the First and Deputy First Minister, several times every week at the moment on a whole range of issues. We've also discussed the protocol, but that is something that we will be discussing with the Special and the Committee for the EU. We are determined to deliver on the protocol in a manner that ensures there is no border down the Irish Sea and unfettered access for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Kirstin Oswald.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Secretary of State will agree with me that the coronavirus crisis is causing deep and genuine concern for businesses, communities and individuals across Northern Ireland. So given that burden and this real uncertainty, does the Secretary of State not agree with me that now isn't the right time to impose new customs and trading arrangements in Northern Ireland, and that the Brexit transition phase must now be extended well beyond the end of this year?
Well, I in effect would refer the Honourable Lady to the answer I gave a few moments ago, which is that the British public want to see us deliver on our promises. The Prime Minister is absolutely determined to make sure we do that, and rightly so. And it isn't. The best certainty we can give to businesses in Northern Ireland is that they will continue to have unfettered access as part of the United Kingdom and to benefit from the trade deals we seek to have around the world.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister further outline the plans in place post-December 2020 to ensure that the UK works and moves as one entity, and that Northern Ireland is not precluded from alignment with its biggest market, mainland GB?
Well, I can say to the Honourable Gentleman that we are absolutely determined to make sure that we deliver the protocol, and we do that in a way that ensures, as we have said, that we deliver on our word, which is that Northern Ireland will have unfettered access to Great Britain, is part of the United Kingdom economy, part of the United Kingdom Customs Union, and will benefit from our trade deals around the world.
What I'd like to is just order. I'd just like to make a very short statement. Those watching our proceedings will have noticed that our attendance today is significantly below the normal numbers. I have discussed with the usual channels ways in which we can limit the numbers of people crowded together to ensure maximum safety. We are all doing our best to keep Parliament sitting and to follow Public Health England and guidance. We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Rob Butler.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will want to join me in paying tribute to Lance Corporal Brodie Gillen, a reservist medic from the Scottish and North Irish Yeomanry who was tragically killed in Iraq last week. My thoughts and deepest sympathies are with her family and loved ones at this very difficult time. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in the House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Rob Butler.
Like many others in the United Kingdom, my constituents in Aylesbury are understandably deeply concerned about COVID-19, and I pay tribute to staff at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, Bucks Social Services and everyone in the community who's helping those with the virus or in isolation. Can my right honourable friend assure the people of Aylesbury and everybody in the country that the government will take whatever action is needed and spend whatever money is needed to save lives and to protect livelihoods?
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to join my honourable friend in paying tribute to the staff at Stoke Mandeville, but to all the staff in our fantastic NHS for the way they're coping at this extremely difficult time, and he can certainly take it that we're not only, of course, we've not only put another £5 billion into the NHS last week, as he heard from my right honourable friend, but we will certainly do whatever it takes and provide whatever funding is necessary to help our NHS through this crisis, and indeed to support the whole country with government guaranteed loans, as you will have heard yesterday.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank you for the statement you just made and for the very responsible approach MPs have taken to today's question time by sitting a suitable distance apart to avoid cross-fertilisation of this horrible disease. I also want to join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to Lance Corporal Brodie Gillen, who was killed in Iraq last week. Our thoughts are with her family and her friends. Today, Mr. Speaker, people are mourning the loss of loved ones. Many more will be suffering from the effects of coronavirus, including those already losing work or losing their jobs and worried about whether they can keep a roof over their head. Our greatest thanks must go to the frontline medical and public health staff who are fighting to combat the spread of the disease, and to the public servants, postal workers in particular, who've given such sacrifices today, and cleaners who are providing vital support. We must also thank those working round the clock to make sure our shops and warehouses are stocked with the essential food supplies that everybody needs. We on these benches will do our duty to hold the government to account. Together we need to ensure that the most effective action is taken to protect people, and it's in that spirit that I ask questions of the Prime Minister today. Every member of the public will make sacrifices in the effort to stop the spread of coronavirus, but those on low pay, self-employed workers and small business owners are understandably worried. Sue wrote to me this week. Her family is in isolation and says the current £94.25 per week statutory sick pay is not enough to pay for the food shopping. Can the Prime Minister do what the Chancellor repeatedly refused to do yesterday and pledge to increase statutory sick pay to European levels?
Prime Minister. Well, I want to thank the right honourable gentleman for the way in which the opposition has been approaching this issue generally, and for the cooperation that has so far taken place between our front benches in this matter, because it is, as he rightly says, this is a national emergency, and we're asking the public to do things, to take actions in a way that is really unprecedented for a government in peacetime, and perhaps even unprecedented in the last century. So, to come to his question, it is only right that when we are asking people to take action to isolate themselves if they have the disease or a member of their household has a disease, if we're asking the public to take steps which jeopardise businesses, cause people to risk losing their jobs, it is absolutely right that whatever their circumstances, we should ensure that workers get the support that they need. So in addition to the package of business support that my right honourable friend the Chancellor outlined yesterday, we will be working with the unions, working with colleagues across the House. We will be bringing forward further measures to support workers of all kinds throughout this crisis.
Jeremy Corbyn.
The UK sick pay levels lag far behind those of European counterparts. The Scandinavian countries are giving many of them 100% of wages during this crisis. And I hope that when the Prime Minister brings forward proposals on this, they do reflect the reality of people's lives. You cannot feed a family on 90-odd quid a week. And those people, therefore, are putting everybody at risk because they have to go out to work in order to put food on the table. And to claim statutory sick pay, workers need to prove they earn a minimum of £118 per week. So I hope when the Prime Minister brings forward proposals, he will give confidence to the millions of people who work on low-income jobs, are in insecure work or self-employed, and commit to extending a very much enhanced statutory sick pay to all workers.
Yes. Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've told the House before, of course we will ensure that nobody is penalised for doing the right thing and protecting not just themselves but also other members of society, and of course making sure that our NHS is able to cope. And clearly statutory sick pay will typically be supplemented by other benefits, but we will ensure, and I just repeat what I said to the right honourable gentleman, we will ensure, since the state is after all making these demands of the public and of business, it is only right that throughout this period we should be doing whatever it takes to support the workers of this country throughout this crisis.
Jeremy Corbyn. What it takes is a recognition of the social injustice and inequalities that exist in this country. And I hope that when the Prime Minister makes the proposals on statutory sick pay levels, that will be recognised. A quarter of the people that are most crucial to support us in this crisis, social care staff, and almost half of home care workers are on 0 hours contracts, so therefore automatically not entitled to sick pay. By not extending statutory sick pay to all workers, the government is forcing social care staff, and they're the people that could unwittingly be transmitting the disease amongst the most vulnerable in our community, to choose between health and their own hardship. Yesterday, the Chancellor, unfortunately, offered nothing to the 20 million people living in rented homes, including 3 million households with children. They're worried sick that they can't pay their rent if they get ill, lose pay, or feel they need to self-isolate. It is in the interest of public health, of the health of all of us, that people don't feel forced to go to work in order to avoid eviction when they know themselves they may be spreading this terrible disease. So will the Prime Minister now confirm that the government's emergency legislation will protect private renters from eviction?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can indeed confirm that. He's making a series of very powerful points, and I can indeed confirm that we will be bringing forward legislation to protect private renters from eviction. That is one thing we'll do. But it is also important, as we legislate, that we do not simply pass on the problem. So we'll also be taking steps to protect other actors in the economy.
Yeah.
Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn.
Seeing the details of that, because all of us represent private sector tenants in our constituencies, and we know the stress they're going through now. They need something said urgently about this, and so I hope the government will say something as soon as possible. Today would be appropriate. NHS staff and those working in the care sector are, Mr. Speaker, on the front line of caring for patients suffering from coronavirus. However, sadly, those workers have no idea if they're actually transmitting the virus themselves. They may not be obviously suffering from it, but they could still be transmitting it. And if they're ill or not, and when they return to work on the front line, what effect it will have. So can the Prime Minister please explain why the government isn't prioritising the testing of all healthcare staff, both those in the NHS and those doing such a vital job in the care sector?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in point of fact, we are prioritising testing of NHS staff for the obvious reason that we want them to be able to look after everybody else with confidence that they're not transmitting the disease. And this country is actually far ahead of many other comparable countries in testing huge numbers of people. We're increasing our tests from 5,000 to 10,000 a day. And it may be of interest to the House to know that we are getting much closer, Mr. Speaker, to having a generally available test which will determine whether or not you have had the disease, and that will truly be of huge benefit to this country in tackling the outbreak.
Jeremy Corbyn.
The World Health Organization said test, test, test. And we should be testing, I believe, on an industrial scale. When I met the Prime Minister on Monday evening, he assured me that there were 10,000 tests per day going on. That's better than none, obviously, but it is nowhere near even the number of people working in the NHS and the care sector. It is a massive undertaking, and I wish there was a greater sense of urgency from the government in getting this testing available for all staff. NHS staff are obviously on the front line, and many are scared because the guidance that has been changed to say they do not need to wear full protective equipment when caring for patients. A senior doctor has said, and I quote, "The rest of the world is providing staff with full protective gear and we're restricting it." And this is a doctor saying, "I'm scared." We shouldn't be scaring doctors and nurses. Is there a policy for them to have full protective equipment or not? Because I believe it should be the case.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're just quickly on testing, just to reassure him, we're moving up to 25,000 a day. And on PPE equipment for NHS staff, he's absolutely right to raise this, and this is of huge concern, obviously, to everyone, that our NHS staff should feel that they're able to interact with patients with perfect security and protection. So there is a massive effort going on, comparable to the effort to build enough ventilators to ensure that we have adequate supplies of PPE equipment, not just now, but throughout the outbreak.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, generations to come will look back on this moment and they will judge us on the actions that we take now. Our response must be bold and it must be decisive. The market cannot deliver what is needed. Only collective public action led by government can protect our people and our society. And that collective action must not allow the burden to fall most on those who lack the resources to cope, as happened after the financial crash. People across the country understand the need for temporary restrictions on our way of life to protect us all, and we will work with the government. But the Prime Minister must understand that will require balancing action to protect the most insecure and vulnerable in the interests of public health as well as of social justice. The health of us all depends on the health of the most vulnerable. So I ask the Prime Minister, will he step up now and not tomorrow and give support to those vulnerable people who live on the margins of our society, are vulnerable themselves and make us all vulnerable, and give them the support and the assurance that they desperately are searching for today?
Indeed, I can, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we've announced another 500 million to go straight into councils to help them immediately with the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable. That's why we've announced immediate cash injections into business to help them through unquestionably a very, very difficult time. That's why we will be bringing forward further measures to ensure that every worker receive support throughout this difficult period. Because no doubt, Mr. Speaker, we are asking, he's right to draw attention to the unprecedented nature of this crisis. We are asking the public to do quite extraordinary things. And we're asking business to shoulder quite extraordinary burdens. But the more effectively we can work together to comply with the very best scientific advice, which is what has actuated this government throughout the crisis, which is what has guided this government throughout the crisis, the better our chances of relieving the burden on the NHS. The more lives we will save, the more suffering we will avoid, and the quicker we will get through it. And be in no doubt that this is, and the Right Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right, this is an enormous challenge for this country. But I think the people of this country understand what they need to do to beat it. And they also, I think, understand that we will beat it and that we will beat it together.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In November, the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care came to visitors at Bassett Law Hospital in Worksop to see the excellent work done by our local NHS. And we were delighted to hear of a £14.9 million investment in upgrading our accident and emergency department. Would the Prime Minister please update us on the progress of this, and would he and the Secretary of State accept an invitation to see the work once it is completed?
Mr. Speaker, well, I congratulate my honourable friend on what he's doing for Bassett Law Hospital. Actually, I remember going to talk to the wonderful doctors and staff at Bassett Law, and they explained in great detail their fascinating plan for improving service for their patients, and I am absolutely determined to support him and them in their ambitions. That's why we've put £15 million already into expanding emergency care capacity in Bassetlaw, and my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, is working, I know, intimately with Bassetlaw to take forward the whole project.
Ian Blackford. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on the killing of Lance Corporal Brodie Gillen? Mr. Speaker, this is an unprecedented emergency, and it requires an unprecedented response. I welcome the fact that the parties across this House and governments across these islands have worked together as we attempt to protect all our peoples. It is the right approach, and it is the very least the public expect and deserve from us. Yesterday, the Chancellor announced a £330 billion financial package for business. Today, the UK Government needs to announce a financial package for people. Members from 6 parties across this House have now expressed support for a temporary universal basic income to help everyone, especially freelancers, renters and the self-employed. Using the current tax system, will the Prime Minister stand up today and give a commitment to provide people with the security of a universal basic income?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank the right honourable gentleman for the spirit in which he's spoken, and indeed there is a huge amount of collaboration going across all 4 nations of this country, as you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, and we are in lockstep. What I would just say on his appeal for a basic income: do not underestimate, Mr. Speaker, the value to people of the measures that we've already announced that will support business and keep jobs going, make sure that those businesses continue in existence. That must be the first step. But then, as I've said repeatedly now to the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition, it is also, he's quite right, it is also important that throughout this crisis we take steps to support workers, and the suggestion that he makes is, of course, one of many such suggestions.
Ian Blackford.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for his answer? And there's a willingness from all of us to work together as we go through this crisis. But, Mr. Speaker, thousands of people are already losing their jobs. It's happening today. Millions will face the same threat. They need reassurance and support, and they need it today. They need an income guarantee. Prime Minister, we must not repeat history. People are worried about their bills. They are worried about keeping a roof over their head. In the last financial crisis, the banks were bailed out, but ordinary people were not. Prime Minister, you have it within your power to protect people's incomes and provide them with peace of mind. At this time, an emergency universal income scheme would do just that. Will the Prime Minister, at the very least, to commit to meeting all of us who support this proposal and discuss how we can protect the incomes of all of our peoples?
Well done, Ian. Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I can make that commitment, and indeed I said as much in my earlier answer to the right honourable gentleman. I think it is very important as we go forward that we try and enlist a consensus in this House about how to support people throughout the crisis. And I agree profoundly with what he said about not repeating history. It is very important that as we ask the public to do the right thing for themselves and for everybody else, that no one, whatever their income, should be penalised for doing the right thing. And we will make sure that that is the case.
Can I welcome confirmation that routine Ofsted inspections will be postponed? And will the Prime Minister join in commending schools, leaders and teachers for all they've been doing in supporting families through this crisis?
Mr. Speaker, I want to pay a particular tribute, not just, of course, to our amazing NHS, but also to our teachers and everybody who works in our schools for everything that they have done to keep our schools going throughout this difficult crisis so far. And, of course, we will do everything we can to remove burdens on schools, and Ofsted is one in particular that we can address, and the House should expect further decisions to be taken imminently on schools and how to make sure that we square the circle, both of making sure that we stop the spread of the disease, but also of making sure that we relieve as much as we can pressure on our NHS.
To Rasoon Alan Khan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My NHS colleagues on the front line are already stressed with the pressure that they face. Last night, I visited my father in a care home and am acutely aware that I may have fed him for the very last time. We are in unprecedented times. I would like to know, where was the forward planning for PPE for our NHS and care staff? Where is the testing for medics? Why are we waiting so long for mass testing? And why are social distancing measures merely just suggestions? Prime Minister, it is right that we have all put party loyalty aside to work together during this time of national crisis, but we must scale up the response. Without good leadership, people in this country will start to panic. There must be no more time for delay. The time to act is now.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with what the honourable lady says, and I thank her for all the work that she does in the health service. And I can certainly tell her that we have stockpiles of PPE equipment, and we are proceeding. And it's very, very important for the House to understand this. We are proceeding in accordance with the best scientific advice, and it is the timeliness of those measures that is absolutely vital in combating the spread of the epidemic. And indeed, that is how you save lives. And I'm delighted that the UK's approach has been commended not just by Neil Ferguson of Imperial College today, but also by Dr. David Nabarro of the World Health Organization.
Edward Timpson. Very much, Mr. Speaker. The weeks and months ahead will test us all and stretch society to its limits. None more so than the National Health Service, which is working day and night to care for the sick and save lives. But together, Mr. Speaker, we will get through this. So will my right honourable friend update the House on his efforts to bring together a coalition of manufacturers to supply the NHS with the ventilators and other essential medical equipment it needs to treat the most adversely affected patients during this pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, as the House will know, there is already a coalition of British manufacturers who are now working together at speed to supply the ventilators that we need. We already have 8,000. We're moving rapidly upwards, and I will keep the House informed on developments.
Chris Bryant, closed question.
Number 8, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his invitation, and I'm happy to consider his invitation to run, and we'll take it up.
Well, what I really hope is that the Prime Minister will look at the whole of the coronavirus crisis through the eyes of the Rhondda, because we have a large number of sole traders, chippies, electricians and plumbers. We've got a lot of people in very insecure employment. We've got lots of people who are elderly and people who are on very low incomes and have next to no savings. Many people have already been laid off this week and are worried that they're going to be laid off in the next fortnight. So we really do need the Prime Minister to address these matters. And if I'm honest, I don't want to be partisan, but it does feel as if we're a bit of an afterthought. So I really, really beg the Prime Minister to look through the eyes of the Rhondda, because I think he would then double sick pay so that it's a sensible figure. I think he would introduce something like a summer version of the winter fuel allowance so that the elderly get some help. I think he would probably introduce some kind of VAT holiday for sole traders. I know he hopes, and we all hope, that the whole of the country will bounce back quickly after this. But I say to him, after the floods and the poverty that we have historically suffered in the Rhondda, communities like mine will find it phenomenally difficult to bounce back if he doesn't take this kind of action now.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman speaks powerfully and passionately, and in my view, wholly rightly for the people of the Rhondda. And I can tell you that our thoughts in this government are with the people of this entire country in helping everyone to get through this this virus. And we will do, as I say, whatever it takes, both to support business and, as I said in my earlier answer to the Right Honourable Gentleman Leader of the Opposition, also to support individuals and families. And I welcome the suggestion, the agreement of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Scottish National Party, that we should do this on a cross-party basis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Member of Parliament for Grenfell Tower, I would like to thank my right honourable friend for the additional £1 billion in the budget for cladding remediation. Moving on to today's events, can my right honourable friend assure me that his government will do absolutely everything to support the economy, businesses large and small, the self-employed, individuals, including those on low income, because now is not the time to be squeamish about public sector debt.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly give my honourable friend that reassurance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the measures, but yesterday's statement offered nothing for the self-employed. My constituency in Vauxhall has an estimated 30,000 self-employed workers, and a lot of those people are already feeling the financial pinch now. And they can't wait for days for the government to announce something. So will the Prime Minister today announce a guarantee of measures that will fully compensate all self-employed workers in this crisis?
Mr. Speaker, I repeat the answer I've given several times to several of her colleagues. We will do whatever it takes to ensure that all workers are protected throughout this crisis.
Stephen Hammond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to, like so many colleagues, extend my thanks to the NHS and all the frontline staff, but also offer my thanks to him, the Chancellor and the Health Secretary for their leadership in this crisis. I think it's warmly welcomed by many in my constituency. The news from the major food retailers this morning was welcome, but many over 70s, vulnerable and self-isolating, will be concerned that they will still have problems about access to food and to medicines throughout this period. Could he confirm what the government is doing to ensure that all retailers and pharmacists are going to prioritise these groups throughout the whole of this virus crisis?
Mr. Speaker, we're extending the hours in which deliveries can be made, and we're talking right now with the Pharmaceutical Services Negotiating Committee about ensuring that pharmaceutical goods get at the right time to the customers who need them.
Neil Hanby. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to COVID-19, there are reports from across the globe of antiretroviral drugs being tested alone and in combination with varying degrees of reported success. In light of this, can the Prime Minister advise the House what resources are being made for drug security, development and clinical trials in the UK, what efforts are being made by him for the UK to work in concert internationally, and does he agree with me that the prize on this occasion must be the victory and not patents and profits?
I endorse completely the sentiment that he has just expressed, Mr. Speaker, about the need to do this collectively. The government's announced a £46 million package of investment in finding a vaccine. A huge amount of work, as I've just said, is going into investing in test kits, and those are changing the whole time and improving the whole time. And we are doing this. The House will be reassured to know that this is being done at an international level, working with our EU partners, working with the G7, the G20, the WHO, the IMF. Everybody is working together on the very issues that he addresses.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend has said, combating this virus will require a huge national effort. Supporting doctors and nurses in hospitals and community carers looking after the most elderly in their homes. Can the Prime Minister assure me and my constituents watching and listening in Warrington South that this government will do all it can to save lives, protect frontline NHS staff and keep the most vulnerable people in our society safe?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, he identifies exactly the three priorities of this government.
Stephen Farray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Defeating the coronavirus must be the top, indeed the only priority for the foreseeable future. There's already huge anxiety across the UK. Businesses are facing unprecedented challenge and uncertainty. So regardless of leave or remain, how quickly will the Prime Minister recognise the inevitable and seek at least a one-year extension to the Brexit implementation process?
Mr. Speaker, our priority is to deal with the coronavirus epidemic, and the other matter that he mentions has already, as he will know, been legislated for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like other town centres across the UK, Burnley has been seeing the evolution of its high street by mixing retail with leisure, which plays a significant role in increasing footfall and supporting SMEs. With that in mind, can I thank the Prime Minister and my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, for the measure as announced in the budget and yesterday? And will he commit to doing whatever it takes to supporting our SMEs so once we get through this challenge, our high streets can buzz once again?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I can indeed confirm that is exactly why we have cut business rates, and that's why we're making very considerable sums available for small businesses, and indeed for very small businesses, precisely to protect the high street and the enterprise environment on which so many jobs depend.
Cavan Jones.
I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree with me that protecting our NHS staff at this crucial time is our maximum importance. This week in County Durham, at least one GP surgeon received surgical masks from the NHS with expiry dates of 2016 on the box. In other cases, boxes, labels have been stuck over the extending the expiry dates of those boxes. What assurance can the Prime Minister give, not only that they get the equipment they require, that it's actually effective once they get it?
Mr. Speaker, to the best of my knowledge, all the equipment we're sending out is of the correct standard. I'd be happy to look at the case that he mentions, and as I said earlier to the House, we currently have stockpiles of PPE, but are making huge efforts to make sure we have enough for the outbreak ahead.
Sarah Dines.
The Chancellor yesterday unveiled a wide range of measures to tackle coronavirus. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's vital we do whatever we can to get through this as a country?
Mr. Speaker, I wholly endorse what my honourable friend has said. We will do whatever it takes, and we will beat it together.
Apart from rent arrears, eviction from a private tenancy, a Section 21 no-fault eviction, is the biggest reason for homelessness. On Friday, I met a 77-year-old woman who'd lived in her home for 15 years. I met a couple caring for a sister with Down syndrome, both due for eviction today. Can I ask the Prime Minister to ask the courts to stop Section 21 evictions, to take the pressure off hard-pressed councils and these really worried families?
Mr. Speaker, she is absolutely right to raise this, and that's why I said what I did to the right honourable gentleman, and we will indeed be bringing forward legislation to address the point that she raises.
Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, in my constituency of Orpington, we've enlisted the support of the voluntary sector providers to join the Council in providing support to the most vulnerable residents in combating the coronavirus. Can the Prime Minister confirm that local authorities like mine in Bromley, who are at the forefront of this, will be given clear guidance in respect to safeguarding and DBS checks for volunteers, as this will allow us to deploy more volunteers when and if the need arises?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, he's absolutely right, and that's why we're speeding up the DBS checks so they can be done in 24 hours. And I want to thank and congratulate all the boroughs throughout this country for the way they are harnessing those volunteers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister talked about supporting families, so can I ask him to show his solidarity for those households headed up by a single breadwinner with dependent children? Today is Day of the Single Parent Family. It was initiated by Ronald Reagan in 1984. Can I ask him to join the Right Honourable Member for Romsey and Southampton North, she's my friend in this, on the steps of Old Palace Yard immediately after this PMQ to show that old or young, rich or poor, big or small, all families matter?
Well, I couldn't agree more powerfully more strongly with what the honourable lady has said. Whether I'll be able to join her, whichever venue she's identified, I'm not sure. I'll have to look at my diary. I think I have a date with you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Can I thank the Prime Minister and his team for the sure-footed way in which they are approaching this crisis? Given what's unfolding in northern Italy and the very real prospect of our brilliant NHS staff being overwhelmed in a matter of weeks, what age and comorbidity criteria are being drafted that will govern access to intensive care and to ventilators?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he raises a very important point, but this is one that is not unknown to the medical profession, and we will be relying on the clinical decisions of those medical professionals.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the matter of whatever it takes more than three-word slogans.
Yes.
Is what I would say to the Prime Minister. And in this case, it actually takes a bit of war socialism. We need to get money into the pockets of the workers. Has he seen EDM 302, which I've proposed, about bringing in a temporary universal basic income to support workers and get money where it's actually needed?
Exactly.
I hear the honourable gentleman loud and clear, and he's echoing a point that was already made by the leader of the SNP, and of course that is one of the ideas that will certainly be considered.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is rightly engrossed day to day in dealing with the developments of COVID-19, but I'd like to ask him to cast his mind a little further forward. The Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer have been clear that the best solution for this is a vaccine, but the Chief Scientific Advisor has said that that could be as much as a year away. I believe he's also suggested that until that vaccine is available, it may be difficult to ease restrictions successfully. Does my right honourable friend agree with that analysis? And if so, what does a sensible exit strategy look like?
Mr. Speaker, the objective of the government and the objective of our scientific advisers is to depress the peak of the epidemic, to make sure that we get through it so that we come out on the other side, and that we do that as fast as possible. I'm not going to give and that's why we're taking all the measures that we've announced. That's why we've announced the package of business support that we have. I'm not going to give a timescale on it, but that is the strategy, and I'm absolutely certain that it will succeed.
Right, we come to presentation of Bill, Secretary Robert General. I'll take them after this. Okay. Minister Tunnell.
Non-domestic rating public lavatories bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Presentation from Secretary Ben Wallace.
Overseas Operations Service Personnel and Veterans bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. We now come to presentation of Bill Leila Moran.
Vagrancy repeal bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 12th of June.
Friday the 12th of June.
We've all been told socially distanced.
I'm just going to hand over now. Oh, I want to. Chris Bryant.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. We had several bills just presented there, but the one bill that we have not yet had presented is the one that the government has talked about extensively, which is the emergency legislation for coronavirus. Now, it is talked of that it will be published tomorrow, and we'll be dealing with it on Monday. I just hope that there will be a process whereby it will be possible to table amendments before second reading, which is not the normal convention, of course, but is for emergency legislation. And I hope that it might be possible for us, for instance, if the government is seriously intending to say that this legislation will last for 2 years, that we'll be able to table amendments to suggest that that could only be with review from Parliament on a regular basis.
It is on the order paper, and I'm sure there will be time to table amendments, and that message will have been taken on board to ensure that that should be made available. Right, we now come to 10-minute rule motion. Bambos, Charalambous.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision about children's access to medical treatment and for connected purposes. The recent case of Tafida Rakib was a sad example of a long line of disagreements over treatment of seriously ill children, which have ended up in court. In February of last year, Tafida, then aged 5, suffered a traumatic brain injury, which left her on a life support machine in a hospital in London. In autumn, and contrary to the wishes of her family, the hospital trust wanted to turn off her life support. Tafida's parents wanted to take her to Italy for further treatment, but this was challenged by the trust, who argued that it was in Tafida's best interest that she should not be taken out of the country, but instead be allowed to die. In a landmark High Court ruling in October, Tafida's parents won the right to take her to Genoa for medical treatment. Tafida was allowed to leave the UK, she received the medical treatment she needed, and just 9 weeks ago she was taken out of intensive care and is now breathing unaided. In another case in 2014, a young boy, a Shire King, who had a brain tumour, was taken abroad, contrary to the wishes of the local trust, for proton beam therapy, which was at the time not available in the UK. Ashai's parents were arrested in Spain for not acting in Ashai's best interest, but the High Court later ruled that he could receive the proton beam therapy in Prague. Following the therapy, which is now available in the UK, an MRI scan found that Ashai was now free of cancer. But not all cases have such a successful outcome as these two examples. Following a breakdown in communication between the parents and medical professionals over an experimental treatment for mitochondrial disease, Mr. Page. These are just two of a number of cases where there is a disagreement ends up in expensive and intensive court proceedings where judges have to make what should be an ethical decision about medical treatment. This is a fundamental flaw in the system that this bill tries to remedy. And it's clear to me that we do not have the appropriate support mechanisms in place to bring parents and doctors together at an early stage where there are disagreements about treatment and to properly address difficult questions which may very well prevent these long, stressful and expensive court cases which are harmful to the child, parents, doctors and the hospitals. In recent months I've met with Chris Gard and Connie Yates, the parents of Charlie, who tragically and in highly public circumstances passed away on the 28th of July 2017. Charlie was born with a rare genetic disorder, MDDS, that causes progressive brain damage and muscle failure. Following a breakdown in communication between the parents and medical professionals over an experimental treatment for mitochondrial disease, the hospital and Charlie Gard's parents entered into a lengthy and distressing dispute involving a series of court proceedings. The case went to the High Court, the Court of Appeal, Supreme Court and even the European Court of Human Rights. The case was painful for all involved, the parents, the medical professionals working at the hospital where Charlie Gard received his treatment and everyone else concerned. The case clearly illustrated problems with the current dispute resolution systems. The court proceedings caused enormous emotional harm and stress to both parents and medical professionals. Both wanted to do what they thought was best for Charlie. Instead of a smooth and efficient process aimed at resolving the conflict, what we saw was a huge entrenchment and precious time lost when Charlie's health was deteriorating. Worse, parents and medical professionals were pitted against each other in the full glare of media, and this helped no one. Since then, Connie and Chris have dedicated themselves to preventing the escalation of conflict and protecting the doctor-patient relationship. These conversations and my observations of a number of similar cases have led me to table this bill, and I'm pleased to say that I have support from honourable members from across the House, as well as doctors, including medical ethicists and former presidents of the British Medical Association and the wider public. Organisations such as the Medical Mediation Foundation are already active in trying to resolve disputes between parents and doctors in various medical settings. A study by the Centre of Health Economics from the University of York also shows that as well as saving time and taking the stress out of disputes, mediation could also save trusts money by resolving issues concerning treatment quicker and without the need for expensive proceedings. Broadly, the bill does 5 things, all geared towards addressing disagreements quickly and clarifying the legal situation so that cases are less likely to end up in court. First, it requires the Secretary of State to put in place measures to improve early access to mediation services in hospitals where conflict is in prospect. Mediation has been proven to be an effective way of re-establishing trust between parents and doctors and helping them work together to make the best decision for the child. But currently, access to and take-up of mediation services is very low. Second, it provides access to appropriate clinical ethics committees so that both doctors and parents can be supported in making difficult decisions by impartial ethical experts. Very few hospitals have access to medical ethics committees, meaning that parents and doctors often face a postcard lottery when looking to get the appropriate ethical advice. This bill would put a provision in place for committees to come together quickly when required and ensure that doctors and parents do take the step of calling for a committee at an early stage when they're faced with difficult decisions. Third, the bill will provide the means necessary to obtain second medical opinions swiftly, ensuring that when requested, parents receive access to the child's full medical data so that those second opinions are fully informed. Fourth, it seeks to provide access to legal aid to ensure that families are not forced to employ costly legal representation or rely on outside interest groups in order to fund representation in the courts. Finally, the bill would create a new legal test of whether an alternative credible medical treatment could cause a child disproportionate risk of significant harm in order to decide whether a parent is able to seek that treatment for their child. This test would replicate the legal test already used by social services, considering whether to remove a child from their parents' care, and would sit before rather than replacing the current best interest test, which is very broad and can be subject to a number of different interpretations. The clarity brought by this test would in turn bring more certainty around the legal outcome of a legal decision, and therefore prevent cases from ending up in court. It is my view, and the consensus view of medical ethics, that if a treatment is not harmful and reputable doctors are willing to provide it, that no one should be prevented from seeking this treatment, and the new test of disproportionate risk of significant harm aims to clarify this. Most of all, the underlying aim of this bill is to prevent conflict between doctors and parents and help support them as they work together during the very stressful and upsetting situations. Conflicts are bad for doctors, they're bad for parents, bad for our NHS, and bad for the children whose care is under consideration. The frequency of these cases and obvious distress it causes all parties have led me to believe that the legal system in this regard is in desperate need of reform. I hope my parliamentary colleagues will agree with me on this. I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As members of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Seema Malhotra, Emma Hardy, Sir Roger Gale, Preet Kaur Gill, Ruth Cadbury, Brenda Sharma, Sir David Amos, Tim Loughton, Kerry McCarthy, Kate Holland, Tayo Owotemi, and myself.
Bambos, Charalambous.
Children, access to treatment bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 27th of November.
Friday the 27th of November. We now come to the first opposition day motion on statutory sick pay and protection of workers, and I call Margaret Greenwood to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is an international crisis, and one where countries need to learn from each other about what is working and what additional steps need to be taken. We also need to come together as a country to support each other as the severity of the crisis is becoming clearer. A Public Health England document estimates that the coronavirus epidemic in the UK will last until this time next year and could lead to almost 8 million people being hospitalised. The impact will be felt not just by those who become ill or have to self-isolate. This public health crisis has really exposed the fault lines in an economy in which insecure, low-paid work is so prevalent. In the budget last week, and again yesterday, the Chancellor announced measures to support business, but there was a glaring omission when it came to workers on low income and those who are unable to work. Public Health England warns that it is estimated that at least 10% of people in the UK will have a cough at any one time during the months of peak COVID-19 activity. The revised health advice is that anyone with a cough should self-isolate for at least 7 days and for 14 days if they live with other people. It is right that people should not go on working when they're not well, but the government's measures so far still leave many people facing a cruel choice between their health and financial hardship, and it's a choice which has impacts on the health of the people they come into contact with too. In response to the Leader of the Opposition questions, the Prime Minister said he would bring forward a package of measures relating to statutory sick pay. We really do need the details on that as a matter of urgency.
On that point, I thank my honourable friend for giving way. To actually claim statutory sick pay, workers need to prove that they are earning a minimum of £118 per week. So does my honourable friend agree that rather than just regurgitating vacuous sound bites like whatever it takes, the government actually needs to bring the statutory sick pay levels to European levels from the current paltry £94.25 a week, which isn't enough to even feed one's family, and they need to extend it to all workers?
My friend makes a couple of really important points about the levels of pay and about the people that are able to access it, and I'll be coming on to those things in my speech. So, so 7 million people are not eligible for statutory sick pay. So that's just under 2 million workers on low income who don't qualify because they earn less than the £118 a week on average. And then there are 5 million self-employed people who don't qualify either. Now, those on low pay are some of the people who will be hit hardest by the crisis. Many work in retail, hospitality and leisure, and we're also hearing of people being laid off in these sectors. Others will be concerned that their jobs may be at risk, and these anxieties could also make them more likely to carry on working even if they are unwell. There are nearly 1 million people on zero-hour contracts. An analysis by the TUC found that the earnings of around a third of them do not meet the threshold for statutory sick pay, compared to 6% of permanent employees, and women figure highly in the numbers of on zero-hour contracts, and around 70% of the women who would benefit from the overall, around 70% of workers who would benefit from the removal of the threshold are women. A government consultation published last year highlighted that workers who do not earn enough to qualify for statutory sick pay may be working when unwell. It said that the government believed that there was a case to extend eligibility for statutory sick pay to people earning less than the threshold. So will the government now extend statutory sick pay to all workers, including those on low pay? Along with the just under 2 million whose earnings are too low to qualify, there are others on low income in the gig economy who are not eligible because they're classified as self-employed. These include care workers, cleaners and delivery drivers, the very people who we will be depending on to an even greater degree than usual over the coming weeks and months, as people have to self-isolate in greater numbers. My honourable friend, the member for Dulwich and West Norwood, has rightly highlighted in a letter to the government signed by 100 colleagues that while NHS England has issued guidance advising trusts to give full sick pay to staff who have to self-isolate because of the disease, care workers on zero-hour contracts will not be protected. Now, they make up a quarter of the social care workforce. Will the government ensure that they also qualify for full sick pay? In the case of delivery drivers, the GMB has worked with Hermes to agree on a fund to protect the income of drivers who fall sick who have to self-isolate. But there are other examples of companies offering derisory payments or even requiring drivers to continue to meet the cost of renting vans even while they receive sick pay. It shouldn't need emphasising how important it is that people in occupations going from one house to another should not go on working when unwell. We depend on people like carers and drivers. The government has a responsibility to protect them if they're unable to work because of the outbreak. There is also a case to extend statutory sick pay to the self-employed more generally, as the Irish government has done. Many people who are disabled, who have been ill, for example, choose self-employment because of the flexibility that it can give them to choose hours that are manageable. However, they also may be now more vulnerable to the virus. The level of statutory sick pay is far too low at only £94.25 a week, so that even those who do qualify for it are likely to struggle to keep on top of even basic household bills. Average weekly earnings are currently £512, meaning that the average worker who has to self-isolate for 14 days will see their income fall by over £850 during that time. I will give way.
The honourable member for giving way, and I wonder if she's aware that research that the Institute for the Future of Work have undertaken absolutely backs up everything she's saying about putting that statutory floor into place so that people are able to economically contribute when it is right for them to do so, yes, and that there is much more resilience within the general population and they have more ability to work when they are fit to do so when that kind of measure is in place.
The Honourable Lady makes a really excellent point, and I thank her for it. Many workers on low pay are unlikely to have savings to fall back on either. 48% of workers in a recent YouGov survey said they wouldn't be able to cover their rent or mortgage and other living expenses if they had to take 2 weeks off work at the current statutory sick pay rate. European Committee of Social Rights found in January of 2018 that statutory sick pay and social protections for the unemployed, sick and self-employed people in the UK were manifestly inadequate. A worker in the UK on the national minimum wage who has to self-isolate will receive less than a third what they would in Germany and less than half the level in Sweden or the Netherlands. The level of statutory sick pay is also set lower than the national living wage, which the government said in the budget it wants to increase. So will the government raise statutory sick pay to at least the level of the real living wage so that people are not pushed into poverty by doing the right thing? The government's approach has been to say people on low income who are not eligible for statutory sick pay can claim universal credit or new style ESA. That is not the answer. Universal credit acts as a vehicle for cuts and the level of support is simply too low. The 4-year benefits freeze will only come to an end in April, and as a result, families living in poverty have been left £560 a year worse off on average. So will the government raise the level of social security payments in order to build resilience in people facing the virus? The 5-week wait for payment of universal credit means there will remain a risk that people will go on working when unwell. The government says people can request an advance, but advances are loans that have to be paid back, often on top of other debts built up during that period. So will the government commit to ending the 5-week wait, and will they change the loan into non-repayable advance? The truth is that people have often have to rely on food banks to survive, as well as advances during the first 5 weeks, and often after that as deductions are made from their universal credit when it finally does arrive. However, there's reports that panic buying by the public is leading to food banks running short. People using food banks can't afford to stock up and so disadvantage still further. The government should be taking measures to protect people in poverty in the current situation. Will the government immediately suspend deductions from social security for anyone who becomes ill or is forced to self-isolate, and consider suspending them for all other claimants? Will the government suspend work search requirements for anyone directly affected by the virus? And will the government suspend all sanctions? In the budget, the Chancellor also suggested that some people who become ill but don't qualify for statutory sick pay could claim New Style ESA. That's £73.10 a week, even lower than statutory sick pay. Someone who is ill as a result of the coronavirus or for any other reason should not be pushed into poverty and left worrying about how they will cope financially in addition. So will the government raise the level of New Style ESA payments? Even to get that, someone has to have built up a contribution record over the past 2 years, which people in insecure work in particular may find difficult to do. The government announced it was temporarily suspending face-to-face assessments for sickness and disability benefits. That is welcome as far as it goes, and we've been highlighting the major problems with the way that assessments are carried out on this side of the House for a long time. But the government has said that it would be replaced by telephone or paper-based assessments. That could risk increasing pressure on GPs at a time when they are already overrun. So can the government tell us clearly how assessments will be carried out during the current outbreak? Media reporting of the virus highlighted that most at risk had underlying health conditions. What is the government's response, therefore, to Mind's call for all reassessments to be suspended to give people security of income at this time? What action will the Secretary of State take to protect people who care for a loved one who was already ill or disabled before the crisis began? Neither person may be directly affected by the virus, but attending a job centre could leave the carer at greater risk of contracting the virus. The truth is that Social Security changes aimed solely at people who are self-isolating or ill will not be enough. There will be other people affected by the crisis. The government has said it will suspend the minimum income floor in universal credit for self-employed people directly affected. Will it also suspend the minimum income floor for all workers, given that many will be affected as a result of the crisis and the impact on the economy? The demands on DWP will be considerable, and the government's own staff may be forced to self-isolate or take time off due to illness as a result of the outcome. So we would like to ask what the government is going to do to ensure that the service can continue. We're calling on the government to do all it can to introduce a form of robust and generous and comprehensive income protection for those whose hours may be cut or asked to take unpaid leave because of the impact of the crisis. In some cases, that will be because of a fall of customers, but if schools have to close at some point, there will also be parents who are not ill and do not have to self-isolate, but who are unable to go on working at least full-time. The Danish government has just announced a scheme that would involve it paying 75% of people's wages in that situation and businesses the remaining 25%. A similar scheme successfully limited redundancies in Germany during the financial crisis.
Would my honourable friend give way? I would indeed give way. I thank my honourable friend for giving way and the excellent comments she is making. I have been told that a major international fast food chain has told its employees that if a branch has to close because of either infection, being quiet or government action, then its employees will only get statutory sick pay and those on zero-hour contracts will get nothing. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that that will not only make it harder for them to do employees to do the right thing, but it is exploitative behaviour on the part of the employers and must be condemned and stopped?
Friend makes a really important point, and she's highlighting the vulnerability of people in insecure work who don't have sufficient level, and also the levels of statutory sick pay which aren't enough to cover people during this crisis. I would, yeah.
She's making such a powerful speech, but may I just echo the point she was making about Denmark? And my understanding is that both the French and Italian governments are looking to introduce exactly the same thing, and that is to support workers' pay, those who are laid off, and being paid directly to the company to ensure that those employees can be retained by the businesses and the businesses kept alive as well.
Honourable friend makes a really important point, and in fact we are working, the Labour Party is working with the TUC and others on looking forward through a package of measures looking at the Danish model in particular. We want to see reassurance to people that they will not lose their jobs and their income, so that they can go on spending, which will prevent a sharp fall in demand, and it would also ease business confidence as firms would see government take part of their wage bill. It's an approach that employers, trade unions and government working together to preserve jobs and protect people from government. We're calling on the government to explore these options. On this side of the House, we're prepared to work in partnership to make that happen. In conclusion, there is a real danger that those already pushed to the margin of our society will be worst affected by this crisis, and those who are struggling on low income, who are disabled, and those who are unable to work will be particularly badly affected. As I've mentioned, we are working with the TUC and others to bring forward a range of measures to extend and raise statutory sick pay, abolish the 5-week wait and sanctions, and provide income and wage support along the lines of the Danish model. We would also ask to join in discussions with the Prime Minister for emergency UBI. We need leadership from government to ensure that everyone is protected if they fall ill, are faced to self-isolate, or to see their jobs at risk or face unemployment. More than ever, we need leadership and policies that reflect the responsibility that we all have for one another.
The question is, as on the order paper, Minister Justin Tomlinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are in extraordinary times. The coronavirus pandemic is the most serious public health emergency that our nation has faced for a generation. This government will do whatever it takes to get our nation through it. We all need to pull together. We can, must and will get through this. And before I go on to the main part of my speech, I do want to pay tribute to all of our fantastic staff, particularly those on the front line, who are doing their level best where they can to help support some of the most vulnerable people in society to be able to continue to receive benefits, and for those that are now in need of accessing those benefits. And I also would say I do recognise that the spirit of this debate is showing Parliament at its best. We are all seeking to work in partnership. These are uncharted times. There are new things coming forward. I've talked to lots of stakeholders in the last few days as we've made announcements for our department, and normally in normal times we could spend 18 months developing policies, testing them, doing engagement up and down the country, talking to people with real life experiences to make sure there aren't unintended consequences, and we are on a daily basis having to review things. And I know that this debate, and it's a credit to the opposition that it is being done in that spirit of partnership, as we can look and feed in things that need to be considered to provide further support, and I know that on a daily basis more support will come forward. Now, our policy is to protect lives and fight this virus with everything we have. Everyone should follow the government guidance to control the spread of the disease. Those who have a high temperature or a new contagious cough and those who share a home with people presenting these symptoms should stay at home in self-isolation for 14 days. Everyone should avoid unnecessary travel and social contact with others, and people who should work from home. This will help to protect the NHS and safeguard those who are the most vulnerable. And I want to reassure members of the House that this government will provide a safety net and support for individuals during this testing time. Everybody will be supported to do the right thing, and this government will help employers to support their employees to do the right thing. Yes, yes.
Well, I know the Minister is very dutiful in the job that he does, and I thank him for that. But I've had contact today from a lady and a mother. She's isolating because of her child. Is she eligible for sick pay from government, or does she have to take dependence leave, which is unpaid, which would be very unfair? And just how can that work?
Well, where people in work are isolating due to government guidance, and that seems to be the case with the circumstances described, then they would be eligible for statutory sick pay through their employers. But also, in addition to that, it is always worth looking on gov.uk to see whether they can also get additional support through the welfare system, whether that's universal credit or new style ESA. And yes.
Minister for giving way. And like him and others across this House, I'm looking to be collaborative, as I generally try to be, particularly in this type of circumstance. But the issue, the type of which that has been raised by the honourable member from Strangford, it typifies the confusion and the information that is out there for people to follow in terms of guidance and support, which is why the suggestion from my right honourable friend at Prime Minister's questions about some form of minimum income guarantee that would cover all of these issues and mean that people could just do what is right at the right time without having to worry about the financial consequences. Is that something that the department is looking at?
I thank the honourable member, and I've said many times at the dispatch box that I do admire the way that he contributes and supports trying to help some of the most vulnerable people in society. And there were 2 points there. First of all, was around the general communication. You know, these are fast-moving events. We all, as constituency MPs, are getting a lot of correspondence with people asking very reasonable questions. Where possible, we're trying to give as good answers as possible. But really, we have to keep putting people towards the gov.uk websites where there is consistent communications and share that. I will just let me answer the second point. Then, in terms of that providing that minimum net, that is where the welfare system comes into play, because statutory sick pay, and it is important, I will go over that, that only applies in some cases, whereas the welfare safety net applies to all who need it. Yes.
Speaker, and I believe the Minister will know that cross-party working is in my DNA, and I really do want to do everything I can to make sure we get this right. This is a personal but a pertinent point. My own son Stuart is self-employed. He has a wife who has had dialysis since she was 14, a 10-year-old son Liam. They're all self-isolating. Stuart is not having an income. They live in rented accommodation. The utilities are essential to keep the dialysis going. I have a very frightened family, and I have very many frightened constituents. Any clarification on what we can do would be most grateful. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The honourable member, who I've worked very closely with on a number of issues, and I know she's held in huge respect across both sides of the House. And I prior to being an MP, ran my own business. I understand the concerns of self-employed people who've suddenly overnight seen dramatic changes to their cash flow, ability to trade as a business. And I absolutely understand the worries that people will face. And that is why we are allowing access to statutory sick pay, or they can, depending on their personal circumstances, looking at whether it's new style ESA, the contributory benefits, which is probably the case for somebody who's self-employed, or the wider support offered through universal credit and the welfare net. So they would need to look at what their circumstances are, talk to the job centres and see what they're doing. We are all trying to do our best to provide as much certainty as quickly as possible through the daily updates.
He will know that very many people are really worried about the financial impact of self-isolation, whether they're sick or not. He's mentioned a few times the sick pay, he's mentioned the alternatives of universal credit and I think ESA. But these sums of money simply won't pay the rent, the bills, or put food on the table. He also mentioned the speed with which action is needed and how much faster the his department is having to react than normal. If this takes till next week to put in place, very many more people will have not taken the action to protect themselves and everybody else. The action is needed now. People need the money now. Please, will he respond on that point?
I absolutely understand the point the Honourable Member is making, and these are extraordinary times. We collectively are all trying to, as quickly as possible, to identify the right levels of support. In pure cash terms, the fiscal support that we've already provided at this stage of the curve is almost the highest across the world. But it isn't complete. As events progress, we've got to do more. We expect more announcements. I understand in an ideal world you could announce everything straight away, but we've got to make sure it is right, and we've got to react as things come forward, and we've got to communicate it as quickly and as clearly as possible. So we do understand that. We do understand that. And let me just make a little bit of progress, because I think some of the things being asked I am about to cover, but I will take more interventions, I promise. And extraordinary times do call for extraordinary measures. That is why we have extended statutory sick pay to those who are self-isolating in line with the latest government health guidance. This guidance is available online on gov.uk. This ensures that eligible individuals, whether they are sick or self-isolating, will be entitled to statutory sick pay if they are unable to work because they are following government advice. The upcoming emergency bill will mean that for people affected by coronavirus, statutory sick pay will be payable from day 1 instead of day 4, as it is currently backdated, and it will be currently backdated to the 13th of March. On that point about getting support to people as quickly as possible, that's why we removed those waiting days. These are crucial measures to ensure that employees do not attend work when they should be staying at home, helping to keep themselves and others safe. These are exceptional circumstances, and we urge employers to do the right thing, use their discretion, respect the medical need to self-isolate. Statutory sick pay is a legal minimum, and employers can offer more. Employers should support, where possible, their employees to work from home to help slow the spread of the virus. If employers do feel the need to require evidence, people are advised to self-isolate for coronavirus will soon be able to obtain an alternative to the fit note by contacting NHS 111 rather than visiting a doctor. We are all aware of the need to protect the GP surgeries so they can concentrate on the key areas of work. And accordingly, the government will ensure that businesses are supported to deal with the temporary economic impact of the outbreak of coronavirus. Small and medium enterprises are at the heart of our economy, symbolising the hard work and enterprising spirit of our nation. To support these employers with the increased costs of sick pay, the emergency bill will legislate that so that employers with fewer than 250 employees can reclaim up to 2 weeks statutory sick pay paid for sickness absences relating to coronavirus. This includes those who are required to self-isolate in line with government guidance, and this measure could provide over £2 billion worth of support for up to 2 million businesses and will be crucial in ensuring that our economy keeps running. This is in addition to other measures to support businesses outlined by the Chancellor yesterday, the £330 billion of government-backed and guaranteed loans, the additional cash grants of up to £25,000 for businesses in the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors with a rateable value of less than £51,000, the cash grants of £10,000 to £700,000 of our smaller businesses, and this government will do whatever it takes to support our economy. Of course, not everyone is eligible for statutory sick pay, which is paid by employers. Gig workers and those on zero-hour contracts may be entitled to sick pay, and they should check with their employer. But there are millions of hard-working people who are self-employed or in the gig economy who will need our help too. That's why during this period we're making it easier to access benefits. And I know the Shadow Secretary of State talked about disability benefits in the announcement that we made earlier in this week. The first decision was to remove face-to-face assessments so that, because we recognised that a significant proportion of those who could be claiming disability benefits are vulnerable, and to avoid them having to do unnecessary travel, to be in busy waiting rooms, and we decided to stop face-to-face assessments. What we don't want to do is stopping new people gaining access to the support that they're entitled to. So we are seeking to continue to do paper-based reviews and telephone reviews, but prioritising those who are new claimants and looking on a daily basis in terms of the workforce. Yes.
Minister, for giving way, and I very much agree with the policy that he's just setting out. But can he clarify what the intention is about reassessments? He'll know that Mind and I think one or two others have suggested that reassessments ought not to be going ahead at the moment, partly because it's very difficult for people to get medical evidence in support of their reassessment claim at a time when doctors are very busy with something else.
And I absolutely understand that point, and the Honourable Member and I discussed this when we first made the announcement. The reality is the absolute priority has to be new claimants seeking to get support through the various benefits, the disability benefits system. So we are looking at that on a daily basis, what we can do. I don't envisage that we will be able to do much beyond that, but what I want to make sure is that those new claimants are able to do that, which is why right at the beginning of my speech I pay tribute to the fantastic work of those who are working on the front line, who like all people are anxious about events but are still where they can coming in to make sure those vulnerable people in society are able to access the support that they are entitled to. And those not... Yes, of course, yeah.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. He talks about statutory sick pay as being part of the safety net, and he recognises then as such as a safety net it is a benefit, if you like, of last resort, and he talks about the way in which companies can offer more. But does he therefore recognise that in this unprecedented situation when so many people are likely to find themselves either by choosing to self-isolate or being obliged to self-isolate in the position of claiming statutory sick pay, that the level is not appropriate to drive the right behaviours or to support people? It is no longer a question of last resort. It is a question of supporting significant proportions of our population, and so it needs to be at a higher level.
Yeah, very good. You'll remember, I'm not the Secretary of State. It's very kind to elevate me to such a lofty position. That's not something that applies. But the broader point, the Chancellor has made it very clear that we will continue on a daily basis to look at what additional support. The government will do what the government needs to do to protect the vulnerable in society and to keep our economy going. And that's why I know many members today will raise very important points. But as a broad principle, the safety net is the wider welfare support, looking at an individual's personal circumstances and tailoring the level of support to them so we can target help to the most vulnerable in society. And those not eligible for sick pay, including those who are self-employed, are able to make a claim for universal credit or contributory employment and support allowance. And last week we laid regulations to ensure that the contributory employment and support allowance is now payable from day one, removing the 7-day waiting days for people self-isolating on government guidance or ill with coronavirus. Claims can also be made over the phone without the need to contact their doctor to get a fit note. Those in self-isolation or sick with coronavirus who make a claim to universal credit can receive up to a month's advance up front without physically attending a job centre. Everything can be done by phone or online, and that is a welcome position. Yes.
What metrics has he taken to ensure that those phone calls are dealt with in a timely manner? There's always complaints about people having to ring and ring and ring and not get an answer.
Well, friend, and you know, we would anticipate unprecedented demand, and that is why part of the reason that we have looked to see work that we no longer need to do during this period, for example, the announcement to end the face-to-face assessments for disability benefits, to move those health professionals onto the telephone systems to make sure that we can cope with the demand coming in, and actually then removing the need for people to unnecessarily visit job centres. So that is something that we're keeping a very close eye on a day-to-day basis. We are also now removing the minimum income floor for self-employed universal credit claimants who have to self-isolate or become ill as a result of the coronavirus during this period. These are the measures, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are taking to ensure that people are supported throughout this difficult period. We've increased access to sick pay, easier to access benefits, support for businesses to protect people's jobs. This is a comprehensive package of support for some of the most vulnerable to society, but we are continuing to look at this by the day. The Chancellor has made it clear there will be further announcements. Yes.
The Minister for giving way. Two of my constituents who were both self-employed have had all their contracts brought to an end. They have a mortgage, they have two young children, and not surprisingly, like many of the other cases members have raised, they are very worried for the future. What support should I tell them the government is going to be making available to help their specific situation?
Hear, hear. I thank you, member, and we're all having similar queries as constituency MPs. And the key is to keep looking at the gov.uk to see the announcements as they are made each day, so there is clarity about what they can and can't get. In this particular case, the honourable member talked about that they had a mortgage. Obviously, we've already made the announcement about the support for a mortgage holiday to protect people. And as part of the next step of our plan is to focus on providing support to people, their income and their jobs. And there will be further announcements. And that is shaped by all of us. As we flag up the issues being brought into our inboxes, that is what is helping shape. This is Parliament at its best through partnership working, and I hope that all members of the House will give all of the work that we are doing and all of our fantastic frontline staff are doing their full support.
Yeah. Neil Gray.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Labour Party for devoting some of their opposition time today to for us all to discuss this very serious issue, which is very pertinent and timely. It's very important given the uncertainty that faces many of our constituents across the UK. But with your forbearance, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to stress at the outset for anyone that is watching that people should follow the advice of their local health authorities such as NHS Scotland or Public Health England. There are regular updates coming from the governments across these isles, and I recommend that as best as possible both employees and employers should follow the guidance that is available. And I want to commend everyone who is leading the response to this situation, from NHS staff and other emergency services, local authorities, the voluntary sector and the governments across these isles, who have been working together as best as possible to ensure that the best advice based on science and the best support is available at the right time. And I wish to pay particular praise to Professor Jason Leach, a former Dux of Airdrie Academy in my constituency, the Scottish Government's National Clinical Director, who, alongside the Health Secretary Jean Freeman and the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, has been the model of calm, erudite leadership. And in the spirit of cooperation, cross-party cooperation that we have seen emerge at Holyrood, I too have no desire to be political or to criticise where working constructively can bring about better outcomes and engender greater confidence in the response of all governments to this crisis. So where I am calling for further action in this speech, I do so not because I think the UK Government is deliberately holding back. I believe there is a genuine desire across all governments to do the right thing at the right time. The concerns that do remain in large sections of society regarding the UK Government's economic response to COVID-19 essentially boil down to ensuring incomes are protected when demand falls from huge sections of the economy. Renters, the self-employed, small business owners, people who are in or out of work just want to know that they're going to get the financial support they need to survive. I've had constituents who are self-employed taxi drivers, driving instructors, childcare providers and many more contact me worried about making sure they're doing the right thing at the right time while also providing for their families and their employees. And both my right honourable friend, the honourable member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, and the Shadow Health Secretary have led the calls for statutory sick pay arrangements to be improved to help workers who are either contract COVID-19 or have to self-isolate. So while we welcome the UK Government's move to make sick pay kick in from day one, and for the costs of sick pay to be met by the UK Government for companies with fewer than 250 staff for a period of 14 days, there is still more to do to support workers and businesses. Statutory sick pay is, of course, a reserved matter, as is employment law, so these are areas that are required to be decided upon here. My right honourable friend compared the statutory sick pay rates in the UK to rates of our European neighbours. And as the House will be aware, that is not currently a comparison for this UK Government. The UK rate currently sits at £94.25, the second lowest rate when compared to EU nations. Ireland doubled its rate to £266 in response to COVID-19, while Germany and Austria both pay £287 a week. At £94.25 a week, the UK Government is presiding over a system of poverty pay for those who are sick. One Tory MP was asked on Twitter whether she could live on £94.25 per week, and she simply responded, "Get a life." This is really serious, Madam Deputy Speaker. We're asking people even if they have mild symptoms, to self-isolate for the greater good, to contain and delay the spread of COVID-19. We must be sympathetic with constituents who are asking legitimate questions about the advice and the support they are getting. In the case of statutory sick pay, it is an issue that should have been resolved before now, quite frankly, but in response to this situation, the UK Government must act and do so quickly. At the Work and Pensions Committee hearing this morning, there was consensus amongst the witnesses to raise statutory sick pay. CAB is asking for it to go to £180 per week. Scope is asking for it to be the equivalent of the national minimum wage. Others have said equivalent to the real living wage would be more appropriate. And Scandinavian countries are, of course, making it 100% of wages. The UK Government must act. And there are alongside the actual rate of statutory sick pay, there are other specific areas we want to see action from the UK Government. By all means.
We have given way. Just for clarification, thank you very much, Mendes. Is he asking for a permanent change in government policy on statutory sick pay, the level of sick pay, or is it temporary for this period?
I think we have to reflect on the fact that even at times not of crisis, the UK statutory sick pay rate is considerably lower than other European nations, and that's something that we should reflect on. So I do think that a permanent change is required, but a temporary measure which might go beyond that permanent increase, I think, is required to deal with COVID-19. So I think it's both, if that makes sense to the honourable gentleman. First, they must extend the policy further to ensure that sick pay is set at an hourly rate and available for everyone for 52 weeks instead of 28. Current rules around statutory sick pay are not flexible enough to meet real-life needs and fall far short of meeting a dignified standard of living, even with this new change. And disability groups have been especially vocal in calling for an overhaul of the sick pay system. Their concerns must be factored into the UK Government's response to their sick pay consultation. And the UK Government should accept the TUC's sick pay for all recommendations, which includes abolishing the lower earnings limit, which would extend coverage to almost 2 million additional workers, permanently remove the waiting period for sick pay, increase the weekly level of sick pay from £94 to the equivalent of a week's pay at the real living wage, and permanently agree to that the legal requirement on fit notes after 7 days of absence be extended to 14 days. And for anything less than this, employers should accept self-certification. They should also permanently provide funds to ensure employers can afford to pay sick pay. The UK Government must also do all it can to support businesses to ensure jobs are kept for the duration of this crisis. I would like to see the UK Government provide much greater grants rather than loans to help all businesses stay afloat, and to attach conditions about ensuring jobs are protected. We have seen this type of initiative from Denmark, and I hope the UK can follow. Clearly, we all hope that these issues are temporary. The UK Government must do all it can to ensure the attachment between employer and employee is not detached. This is important for workers, for employers and the wider economy. Indeed, yesterday, Robert Choate, the Chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility, urged the UK Government not to be squeamish about spending whatever it takes to prevent mass foreclosures, bankruptcies and millions of job losses as the UK effectively goes into lockdown. He said, "When the fire is large enough, you spray the water and worry about it later." So, turning now to measures to support people who are self-employed and other business owners, the UK Government must do more. I echo the calls from my honourable friend from Glasgow Central last night. We must protect the incomes of people who are employed and do so quickly, self-employed, and do so quickly to give them confidence. My honourable friend was also right to raise the issues around maternity leave and parental leave and support for people with no recourse to public funds. They are extremely vulnerable at the best of times, but right now they must be supported. The UK Government must give information to the devolved governments as quickly as possible and encourage much greater information sharing to allow all governments to act swiftly and appropriately. At Prime Minister's questions, my right honourable friend raised the prospect of some form of minimum income guarantee, such as a universal basic income. The Prime Minister appeared to accept this general premise, but the time is now of the essence. Can the Minister give an idea of when he expects some form of announcement for people receiving financial support? The UK Government should consider whether they will extend the normal deadlines for people providing the necessary information to support social security applications while paying people much quicker, as the demand is likely to be much greater. There is clearly a need to go further on social security. Ministers have heard me discussing the various issues that there are with universal credit routinely. The changes I want to universal credit, although they would undoubtedly help in this crisis, may not be practically achievable in a useful timescale. I'm talking about scrapping the 5-week wait, the 2-child cap and increasing work allowances. Instead, for the duration of this crisis, I think the UK Government needs to ensure that those who are in or out of employment, those who are employed or self-employed, the UK Government needs to ensure everyone is paid an amount that allows them to get through. So universal credit advances, for instance, should now come in the form of a grant, not a loan. Another area the Government should look at is to urgently suspend the tax credit income disregard for reductions in earnings, at least for the 2020-21 financial year, to ensure that where earnings fall, household tax credits entitlement takes account of this loss. We also now know that schools, certainly in Scotland and Wales, are to close at the end of this week. And this puts huge pressure on families who rely on free school meals. So I would urge the UK Government to look at this area as well for the pressures that are going to be on these families for the duration of these school closures.
Will he give way?
Of course I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And one of the issues which constituents have contacted me about a number of times over recent days is the issue of finance in relation to households who rely upon prepaid meters for their energy. Now, these households are likely to already be financially more vulnerable. It's very likely that they have to travel some distance to get these meter top-ups that they require. I would ask if, as part of this thinking, the UK Government could give serious thought to compelling the energy companies not to cut people off, to making sure that they take account of the fact that there will be higher needs for energy and that there will be less money to go round whilst that's happening.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. There are many calls being made across the country today for direct payments to be made from the Government to utility companies to ensure that people in these circumstances don't miss out. But it goes back to the original premise of what I introduced my speech by saying, which was that all of this boils down to ensuring that incomes for people, regardless of their circumstances during this period, are going to be hit. And so the Government needs to provide some form of minimum income guarantee to ensure that people in all circumstances are able to get through, whether that is via statutory sick pay or the social security system, or if they're in work, to ensure that if they've lost hours, that can be picked back up again so they continue to pay their bills and continue to live a sustainable life. The monthly allowance for universal credit in these terms should also be increased dramatically, and all other social security payment levels should be swiftly reviewed as well. Clearly right now, this is not business as usual. We cannot continue to pay social security rates which impoverish in normal times, never mind now. And we're going to have to accept that to get through, the UK Government is going to need to inject a massive amount of money into the economy to make up for what is undoubtedly going to be a massive downturn across a wide range of sectors, the like of which I don't think we've ever seen before. A downturn that will result from the actions that the UK Government and other governments are rightly taking in asking people to self-isolate and take other actions to contain the virus. We cannot tell people to stay away from work if any member of the House has symptoms, to stay away from restaurants and bars and cinemas. We can't ask people to work from home and not expect an economic impact, an employment impact and an income impact. The UK Government must fill that hole to ensure it fulfils the promises of the Prime Minister that nobody will be penalised and everyone will be protected for doing the right thing. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to conclude with an encouragement to everybody who may be following this debate. Please be community-minded. We have already seen some fantastic ideas and responses to this crisis in all of our communities. Watch out for your neighbours, help if you can. Buy only what you need. If you have the means to buy more, add what you can to the food bank trolley, and know that others certainly do not have the ability to stockpile. So many of my constituents are already worried about how they will access essentials because they are self-isolating, or they have lost their job, or have other vulnerabilities. Now, like never before in so many of our lifetimes do we need the community-mindedness that got previous generations through such emergency situations. I think we also need to start talking about how those of us who are fit and well, who have contracted and come through the other side of COVID-19, can help key sectors of the economy and emergency services cope with what is to come. I suspect in time, with self-isolation and illness, we'll need to mobilise that volunteer army, but that can only happen if we ensure everyone has their income protected. Support for business is important, but at the end of the day, it is going to be income protection in whatever form that derives, a cash grant, a temporary universal basic income, that will finally give everyone the comfort to do the right thing by society. That will give the answers to the questions we're all getting from businesses, the self-employed, renters and others, and I hope within hours rather than days the UK Government will do the right thing and guarantee incomes as we've seen in other nations. We are willing to discuss any potential measures the UK Government is thinking of, making sure this is done properly and done quickly.
Hear, hear. Hear. Stephen Timms.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the honourable member who's just spoken from Airdrie and Shotts mentioned in passing the fact that the Work and Pensions Select Committee has met this morning. We've took evidence from 5 organisations, from the Royal National Institute for the Blind, from Mind, from Scope, from Citizens Advice and from the Zacchaeus 2000 Trust, representing the Disability Benefits Consortium, and the main purpose was to take evidence about disability benefit assessments, but of course we took the opportunity to raise some of the current issues that we're discussing in this debate as well. And I would just like to put on record, Madam Deputy Speaker, my thanks to the members, the staff and the witnesses from all those organisations that they were willing to take part in a very useful session this morning, despite the difficult current circumstances. I welcome the announcements the Government has made, and as the Minister has recognised, there is going to be a good deal more to do, and the examples we've had referred to from other countries underline that, in order to protect individuals through this very difficult time. And I very much hope with others that those additional announcements will happen very soon. I think we need them very fast. I want, first of all, just to raise a couple of issues about universal credit. I put the point to the Chancellor yesterday that somebody who is self-employed and who self-isolates very often will have to forego their income as a result. The advice is to apply for benefit, but if you apply for universal credit, you don't get any help for the first 5 weeks other than a loan, which then has to be repaid. And it seems to me that people in that position are not going to be willing to give up their income if all they're going to get is a loan. Now, the Chancellor, in answering my question, correctly said that people can apply for the new ESA, the contributory ESA, and I welcome the fact that that is now available not only to people who are themselves sick, but people who are having to self-isolate because others in their household are sick. But as the Minister will recognise, there are going to be quite a lot of people in this position who do not meet the contribution criteria for ESA. They have not paid 26 weeks' worth of contributions, having earned above the lower earnings limit within the last 2 years. So they will be in the position where the only opportunity they will have is to apply for universal credit. And as I say, if they only get a loan, many of them, I think, will feel they've got no alternative but to carry on working, even though they will know that really they ought to be self-isolating. The attraction of the proposal that was made by the honourable member and has been made by Citizens Advice and others, that these advances should be made repayable, non-repayable grants for the duration of this crisis, it is something that the Department could readily do. I recognise that expecting the Department to make big changes to its IT systems very quickly for supporting universal credit may not be practical, but I think making these advances non-repayable could quickly be done. The Minister and both Ministers on the front bench, and I'm pleased to see them both in their place, are very familiar with concerns we have on the Select Committee about the 5-week delay in universal credit. Anyway, there is growing evidence, a very striking article published in The Lancet this month about people being pushed into clinical depression because of being on universal credit rather than on legacy benefits. The Trussell Trust finding that many more people on universal credit need to go to a food bank than those who are on the predecessor benefits. And if you look at what it is about universal credit that's causing these problems, the only really big structural issue is the 5-week delay. And as the ministers know, the Select Committee will shortly be starting an inquiry on that particular topic. That's a broader issue, but for the duration of the crisis, I do think the case for making those advances non-repayable is a very powerful one. Can I, Madam Deputy Speaker, raise the situation of quite a large group of my constituents, and I appreciate this will not be the case everywhere, but it is the case in constituencies like mine, that there are many families, working families, who have got leave to remain in the UK, but they don't yet have indefinite leave to remain in the UK. They're on what is called the 10-year pathway to securing indefinite leave. And what that means is that every 2.5 years they have to apply again for leave to remain. And they're working, they get leave to remain, but, and I don't know whether this is universal, it's certainly the case for a lot of my constituents, the cards which they get, which make it clear they've got leave to remain, they're permitted to work in the UK, also say they have no recourse to public funds. They're not allowed to claim any benefits at all. That clearly, in the current circumstances, puts them in an extraordinarily difficult position. They're not allowed to claim ESA or universal credit at all. And for them, if they're in a position where they should self-isolate in accordance with the government's guidance, they will find if they do, they suddenly have absolutely no income at all. There's a similar, related issue, I think, about the habitual residence test, which is often applied to perfectly properly to make sure that people are habitually resident in the UK and therefore are entitled to benefits. But I wonder if in the current circumstance as well, there is a case for suspending that, at least in some circumstances, because what we want is those who are working to be able to self-isolate when it's important that they do so. If they don't have access to public funds for one of these two reasons, then they will find it practically impossible to do so. And I do hope that the ministers will look at that along with their colleagues, no doubt, in the Home Office. The Citizens' Advice has argued that there should be a temporary repayment pause for claimants, and I think that's a strong point to make in the current crisis as well. People who are having to repay their universal credit advances, or perhaps paying past tax credit overpayments back through their universal credit at the moment. I think there is a case for those to be suspended. The Minister, in his opening speech, made the point, and I quote, that everybody will be supported to do the right thing. I think he's absolutely right to underline the importance of that. But for those who don't have recourse to public funds, those who don't meet the requirements of the habitual residence test, as things stand at the moment, they will not be supported to do the right thing. I think it's very important that they should be. In the budget, the Chancellor said that he was temporarily removing the minimum income floor in universal credit. When we came to read the budget documents, the position was, and as the Minister set out a few minutes ago, that this removal only applies to those directly affected by COVID-19 or by self-isolation, according to government advice. I must say, I think the government should stick with what the Chancellor of the Exchequer actually said, which is that the minimum income floor is going to be suspended altogether, because there will be quite a lot of self-employed people, and my honourable friend gave us an example earlier on in the debate, who see a big fall in their income because of what's happening in the wider economy, not because they are themselves directly affected as yet by COVID-19. And universal credit does give the opportunity for an increase in support to be provided when their income from self-employment falls. And that could work very well, I think, if the minimum income floor was suspended altogether, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer appeared to indicate was going to be the case in his budget speech last week. So I do hope that that will be looked at again, and that the caveats that have been added to that commitment since might be taken away, and that the minimum income floor will be suspended altogether for the duration of this crisis for self-employed people. I also, Madam Deputy Speaker, want to echo the point that was made a few moments ago by the honourable member who speaks for the Scottish National Party about the tax credit disregard. As things stand at the moment, if your income falls by less than £2,500, your tax credits don't increase at all. There is, in the tax credit system, a mechanism that can be used to provide people with help when their income falls. In order to get the full benefit of that, we would need to remove that £2,500 disregard. I appreciate that's a matter for the Treasury rather than for the Department for Work and Pensions, but I hope it will be done. Statutory sick pay is a big focus for this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me just make this point, that the government did consult last summer on extending statutory sick pay to those who are lower paid, those who are earning below the current threshold. But the government hasn't yet responded to that consultation. It was a consultation that was carried out several months ago. Surely, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is now the time to act. It was proposed then that statutory sick pay should be paid to people earning less than the lower earnings limit at 80% of their wage. That, I think, was the government's proposal that it consulted on. This is surely time to fast-track that proposal, to bring that proposal forward and put it into place. I appreciate it's going to need legislation to do it, but it seems to me it's very important that it is done, and I would hope that it could be picked up in the legislation that's going to be published tomorrow. Give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. On this point about statutory sick pay, two additional points there that I think the government really does need to act on. One is that this should be done in advance, up front, rather than having to have businesses reclaiming, which is putting massive pressure on them. And the other is for the self-employed. It's vital that the self-employed, because businesses in my Aberavon constituency are really under the cosh, and they need both of these measures to be...
On the second point, my understanding is that self-employed people in this position can apply for this new ESA if they meet the contribution conditions, which of course some won't, and that's where I think universal credit needs to be changed. But I think one of those routes is likely to be a solution for them rather than statutory sick pay, because that does depend on there being an employer in place. A final point I want to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is about the argument that's been made by many, and I'm sure it's going to be made again in this debate, that the overall level of benefit should be higher, at least for the duration of this crisis, than it has been up until now. And I just want to make one argument in favour of that proposition. We've always say, and we've said on both sides of this House, that work is the best route out of poverty, and the system is designed to encourage people to seek and to find work. But at the moment, there are lots of people, and it's going to be a growing number over the coming weeks, who actually we do not want to work. We don't want to force people into jobs. In some cases, I mean, of course, for many, the position will continue to be the same in the next few weeks that it has been in the past. But there's this large and very important group who we really do not want to be working. We want them to be at home. And I think that particularly does make a case for ministers looking temporarily at raising the levels of benefits, statutory sick pay and universal credit and the others, given the current situation.
A final point, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome what the Minister said earlier about suspension of face-to-face assessments for disability benefits. But I think what he suggested was that in practice his department will not be conducting reassessments for disability benefits either. I think if that is the practical reality, it would be very helpful if the Minister could explicitly state that. I think that would be very reassuring to a lot of people who are in receipt of disability benefits at the moment, would expect to have to be reassessed in the next few months. It's always quite an anxious time for people who are in that position. If the reality is they're not going to be reassessed for several months because everybody's so busy with everything else, I think it would be very helpful for that to be made explicit so that that reassurance can be provided. Of course, if it does turn out there are ways of doing the new assessments that don't require face-to-face meetings in the future, and if this actually works well for those new applications, then hopefully will be lessons that can be learnt for the system in the longer term. But if it is possible to make it clear that there will not be any disability benefit reassessments in the immediate next few months, I think that would be very widely welcomed.
Order, it may be helpful for members in the chamber to know that Mr. Speaker has received a message that we're expecting a statement at 5 p.m. to be delivered by the Secretary of State for Education. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to follow my right honourable friend, the member for East Ham, who made a very powerful speech, and particularly the points he made around refugees and asylum seekers whose plight and specific issues facing them has not been discussed nearly enough, I don't think, over the last few days and weeks. Madam Deputy Speaker, at times of national, and in this case global crisis, only governments have the resources to protect our society, to protect our health, to protect the most vulnerable, to protect businesses and production, and to protect workers. Markets cannot do this. Only government can, and that is why government can and must step up to ensure that we do protect all of our citizens, to direct our national economy and to help and support those people who most need it, and to ensure resources get to where they most need. I'm going to primarily talk this afternoon about statutory sick pay and issues around that. But can I just also say that when newspapers report today that some Harley Street clinics are offering tests for coronavirus for £395 so that you can get this test if you have the money, but you can't get this test if you work in a GP surgery, that is utterly unacceptable. And the role of government is to intervene to ensure that the resources go to where they are most needed. And that is not to the rich and to the powerful. It is those people who are delivering our frontline services and need protection. And I urge government ministers to do that. The measures taken by the Chancellor yesterday were necessary and they were worthwhile to protect our economic infrastructure, to support particularly sectors of our economy that have been most severely hit, to support businesses who are not responsible for the collapse of demand that they are now seeing. But the same is also true for workers. They are not responsible for the predicament that they now find themselves in, and yet support for them was missing in the statement from the Chancellor yesterday. And the Minister has said today that everybody will be supported to do the right thing, and the Prime Minister has said that as well. And we all want that, Madam Deputy Speaker. But I'm afraid at the moment that is not the case. People are not being supported to do the right thing, because the right thing for many, many people now is not to go to work, not to spread this virus, but to stay at home. But if we really want people to do the right thing, we need to support them to make that decision. And so I'll now come, Madam Deputy Speaker, to talk about statutory sick pay. It has been well rehearsed in the debate this afternoon and in the debate yesterday, but it obviously needs to be said time and time again, because so far the measures haven't been taken that are needed. Statutory sick pay is not enough to be able to support yourself and your family. The level of statutory sick pay is insufficient. The eligibility is also a huge problem. If you are self-employed or you earn below the lower earnings limit, you are not able to get statutory sick pay. So some of the people who most need it are denied the support that the government say that is necessary. There are other people who are not sick but also need support. If you are self-isolated, you might not have symptoms, you may not be sick. But the right thing to do is to stay at home. And if we want people to stay at home, they need support. Similarly, carers, and we're going to have a statement from the Secretary of State for Education later this afternoon. If, as it now seems inevitable, many parents are going to have to take time off work to look after their children, they are not sick, Madam Deputy Speaker, but they need support to do the right thing. But of course, there are also many, many people who are facing redundancy, whose businesses cannot employ them anymore, or if they are self-employed, there's just not the work coming in. And those people, at the moment, are not able to claim statutory sick pay, and they will have to wait in the queue for universal credit or ESA if they have those contributions. Well, I say to the Minister, that is not supporting to people to do the right thing. And so we'll come on to the point, but first of all, I will take an intervention from the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful. Does she also agree with me that there are workers who've had their shifts cancelled? Yep. Who've been told that their hours are reduced, many of them on 0-hour contracts, and they too also need that support that she's quite rightly saying should be given to workers.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. And for many people, if they see a temporary reduction in their work, they can draw on their savings. But for many, many others, and many people, certainly who I represent, and I know the Honourable Gentleman's constituents as well, do not have the savings to draw on. Absolutely. The Resolution Foundation published evidence last week ahead of the budget to try and influence the budget that showed that people on low and middle incomes, 60% of them have less than £100 of savings. Yep. They don't have the resources to draw on, even for a temporary period of time, to pay the rent, to pay the mortgage, to pay the bills and put food on the table. And so we must offer more support. And that is what other countries are doing, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Norway, full pay for those laid off for 20 days. The self-employed get 80% of their average income over the last 3 years. In Sweden, laid-off workers guaranteed 90% of their income. The government will pick up half of that, and employers are expected to pick up the other half. In Denmark, the Danish state will pay 75% of the salaries of laid-off workers. And that's the same in many other countries as well. If it's good enough in Denmark and Sweden and in Norway and in other countries around the European Union and elsewhere, then frankly it is good enough for workers in this country as well. And with some urgency now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government have got to come back to this House and tell us that support is not just available for business, although that is very welcome, but that support is available to workers as well. Because unless that happens, then people are not going to be able to self-isolate and stop this virus from spreading, but also this health crisis is going to become an economic crisis where many, many people are paying the price for this virus, and it didn't need to be this way. So let us look at income replacement and let's get there quickly to ensure that the help is available. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this isn't just about helping people now, as important as that is. If we put in place income replacement so that people are not laid off or made redundant, then we're also supporting the economic recovery. Because this crisis, this pandemic will pass. And we must believe that, and we know it is the case. But when this pandemic does pass, and people want to go out again, and people want to start spending in shops and in restaurants and bars and theatres and cafes and travel on aeroplanes, then we need to ensure that the economic fabric of our country is still intact. And the best way to do that is to ensure that workers remain attached to the firms who have been employing them. And so income replacement can help people now, but it can also ensure that our economy can get back on a sound footing when this crisis has passed. And so to build the economy we need to see after this, again I would urge the government to urgently introduce a system of income replacement to help the economy recover. The issue of renters has also been mentioned this afternoon by the front bench and by other honourable and right honourable members. There was support yesterday for people with mortgages, and again, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is very welcome. But many people, particularly those in precarious work and those on low pay, do not have mortgages. They are privately renting, or they're renting in the social sector. In my constituency of Leeds West, less than a third of homes are owner-occupied. The others are either in the private rented sector or in the social rented sector. And we need to do much more to support those people as well, because if they are on statutory sick pay now, or if they've seen a fall in their income, or if they are expecting to be made redundant, then frankly they're not going to be able to pay their rent in the days and the weeks ahead. And so it was welcome that the Prime Minister said there will be support for renters. We need to see the detail of that, and we need to see that support coming directly to landlords and renters to ensure that nobody is penalised because they don't have the money to pay their rents right now. And that means support for local authorities who are big letting agents, big providers of social housing. The money needs to go to the housing, the support needs to go to the housing associations and also large landlords. And we should be working with local government to ensure that we are reaching and talking to the biggest letting agencies and estate agents to ensure that that support is getting to people on the ground. But again, I just can't say how important it is that this action is needed urgently. The representative of the hospitality sector said last night that we are staring into hundreds of thousands of redundancies in that sector alone. So income replacement and support for people in the rented sector is crucially important. And the support for mortgages is a 3-month holiday. And again, I'll just say, I'm not sure that that is the right approach in the private rented sector, because a 3-month holiday on your mortgage, and you could then add that to your mortgage debt, is one thing. But if in 3 or 4 months' time you've got 4 months' worth of rent to pay, that is not going to be much good to people who may not have found their incomes have recovered by then. So we need to be sensitive about ensuring that the support is there for the period of time that it is needed for. Finally, I just want to say something about gas and electricity and broadband and television licences. These are all essential services for people, and they're going to be more essential in the weeks and the days and the months ahead as more people are having to stay at home. And broadband is now absolutely an essential service, because the only way that many people can get food delivered is by ordering online. And so, again, I would urge ministers to say to the providers of those essential services that nobody should be cut off from those essential services as long as this pandemic lasts, because otherwise people are going to find themselves without the very basic infrastructure to be able to stay in their homes. All of this global pandemic has thrown into sharp relief some of the problems in our labour market and in our social security system. And so when this is all over, we cannot go back to business as usual. Absolutely. If you can't survive on £94.25 on statutory sick pay when there is a global pandemic, then, Madam Deputy Speaker, you can't survive on £94.25 at any other time. And so we need to look at the waiting time for universal credit, the level of statutory sick pay, who is eligible for it, and also, frankly, how our labour market works. We have 1 million people on zero-hour contracts. We have almost 5 million people who are self-employed. Some choose to be, but many have no choice. And so we do need to look at how our economy works and who it works for. Because whether you're in the midst of a global pandemic or not, there are too many people in our country who our economy, our labour market and, frankly, our society doesn't work for.
Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for Leeds West, and my right honourable friend, the member for East Ham, the chair of the Select Committee. And I want to build on some of the points they were making, both about the practical challenges that people face in the midst of this pandemic, but also some of the fundamental questions it should pose to each of us as members of a society that have left far too many people far too dangerously exposed, not just in the face of this pandemic, but to everyday life, the plight that has gone unanswered for far too long. And I want to begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, also by paying tribute to particularly those workers in the NHS who are putting themselves, frankly, in harm's way as they treat people in the midst of this pandemic. And I absolutely echo what my honourable friend for Leeds West said. It's crucial that NHS workers have access to the right kit to do the job, and that where there is any concern about the diagnosis of those NHS workers or their family members, that they are considered priority cases for testing. Frankly, the government's claim to be amongst the best in the world at testing only tells us that the rest of the world has much more to do, because we are hearing far too many cases of people who do need to be tested not receiving that test. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the crisis we face isn't just a public health crisis, it threatens to be an economic one. The supply and demand side shocks that it will pose will be both simultaneous and severe, and that requires coordinated action on the part of government and industry on a scale that, frankly, we haven't seen since the Second World War. It is going to require a wartime mobilisation for this peacetime crisis. And for many families, this afternoon and this evening, as they gather around the kitchen table to consider what a loss of earnings or perhaps loss of employment would mean for them and their families, they are staring at the hard reality of a social insecurity system that has left far too many people grappling with poverty and insecurity and an ongoing crises as a result for far too long. No one can or should be expected to live on statutory sick pay of £94.25 a week. No one should be expected to live on universal credit, which in some cases can be even less generous, if that's the word, than statutory sick pay. And so I echo the calls we'll hear this afternoon for increases to statutory sick pay and universal credit to ensure that our social security system provides just that, social security, not just in the worst of times, but in the best of times for our country too. And I think ministers should ask, but frankly, so should people in our communities, how it was that the political choices of successive governments and, frankly, the political demands of sections of the electorate ever allowed a position in which we allow people who've fallen on hard times to fall into harder times further still because of the social insecurity system that pushes people further into poverty, further into mental ill health, and further into family crises, which make it harder, not easier, to escape from. I suspect, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm one of a minority of people in this House who knows what it is like to grow up in a household that is reliant on the social security system, to know what it's like when there is more days left at the end of the month than there is money. What it is like when people have to beg, borrow and steal to put food in the fridge. What it is like when the electricity meter has run out and so has the emergency. And what it is like to feel a victim of the state rather than supported by the state. So we should resolve, in the midst of this crisis, that once this is over, never again are we going to allow our social security system to fail people in the way that it did before this crisis and which it threatens to do within this crisis. Yesterday, the Chancellor set out a whole series of measures to help businesses and to try and get the economy through this, and I welcome those measures. But we've got to learn from past mistakes. It is not enough to bail out businesses, which is important. We also have to bail out people. And as we build the economic recovery, we have to ensure that the quantitative easing that helps provide liquidity to our economy to help things going as best as they can in difficult times is also a quantitative easing for the people too. So by all means, let's call for an increase in statutory sick pay. Let's call for an increase in universal credit. Let's call for an increase in disability benefits to make sure that people can live with dignity and a good quality of life if they are unable to work. All of those things are important. But instead of quibbling around with piecemeal measures here, a bit of mortgage relief here and a bit of rental support there, why don't we just provide every household in this country with the security to know that the government will provide protection for people's incomes so that they can continue to make sensible choices for their families, so that they know that when the end of the month comes and the mortgage is due, that they can pay it, so that they know when the rent is due, that they can pay it, so that they know that when the bills are due, they will be able to pay them, so that when they have to go and do their shop, that they will be able to pay for it. I have always been a sceptic of the principle of universal basic income, because I fundamentally believe in an economy and a social security system that redistributes wealth from those who have it to those who need it most. And I'm also cynical, Madam Deputy Speaker, because while there are many principled and decent-minded champions of universal basic income on the left of politics, the left should regard the principle with suspicion when some of its leading champions have been right-wing economists, like the father of free market economics, Adam Smith. There is a right-wing vision of universal basic income which is about dismantling the state and which says, well, if we provide everyone with the income, we don't need to provide the services centrally because people can pay for it. It's one of the reasons, I suspect, why the Trump administration hasn't needed much persuasion to provide a form of basic income. But while we should regard the principle with suspicion as an ongoing solution to how we provide social security for people, I think there is now a strong case for a form of basic income to see us through this crisis. It could be a universal payment made available to everyone, where the tax system is used to recoup money from those who genuinely don't need it. It could be a form of basic income where those who need it simply apply for it and then receive it. It could be a form of income protection, like those described by my honourable friend, the member for Leeds West, which is already working well in Scandinavia. But one way or another, we have to make sure that families have incomes to see themselves through this crisis, because, as we have already heard, the majority of people in this country tonight are one payday away, or lack of payday away, from being in a real crisis. And the crisis for them will be a crisis for all of us if demand is further sucked out of the economy. So I hope that that's a message that ministers will take back to the Treasury. The final thing I want to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is it's not just the social insecurity system that's left people exposed in this crisis. We've got to make sure that this is a turning point. It could be that our political choices further entrench inequality in our society, frankly, as the coalition and Conservative governments did after the last financial crisis, where too many of the political decisions and too many of the so-called tough choices to balance the books were balanced on the backs of the poorest. I'll give way.
The honourable member is making a very good speech, and I agree with much of what he, if not all of what he has had to say. And he's making a very important point, coming to a very important point about what happens after all of this. There's been a massive fiscal stimulus over the last week, and we expect more to come. What I think all of us would expect is for us not to get into a position where we have austerity Mark II in order to see us out the other side of this.
I wholeheartedly agree with this point, and let me conclude now, Madam Deputy Speaker, by making this point. In the aftermath of the last financial crisis, the Labour government, and in fact the reputation of the Labour Party, was utterly trashed because Gordon Brown's government took the courageous steps that were needed to prevent a financial crisis in America, which became a global financial crisis, becoming a depression where people wouldn't be able to take money out of the banks. The government was right then not to be squeamish about borrowing, to make sure that our country got through it, and this government shouldn't be squeamish now. I suspect that by the end of this, the government will own a larger stake of the British economy that will make Labour's last manifesto look positively conservative by comparison in its ambitions. And if that's what it takes to see us through this crisis, that is what the government will have to do. We are going to need a wartime response to get us through this crisis, so let us think now about the peace that will follow. And just as our generation looks back on that 1945 Attlee government with pride at the decisions they took and the legacy they left, let's think now about the legacy that we will leave for our country. Let's make the choices now that lessen inequality in our country and provide genuine social security in the best of times, not just the worst of times. Let's ask how it was that political choices left our social care system at breaking point and the people languishing in it more exposed to this pandemic than they would otherwise have been. And let's repair our broken social care system by making brave political choices. Let's care more about how we fund the living to lead a good life than about how we tax the dead. Let's make sure that when people look to old age, they're not just looking back on a life well lived, but able to live life to the full until the very end. Let's see this as a wake-up call, that if a pandemic can seriously disrupt the labour market and we have to provide serious income protection to see it through, then let's think about what a technological revolution will do as it displaces, relocates and significantly changes the shape of the labour market. And let's make sure we have the social protections needed now to face the next revolution, not just the current crisis. And let's not let this global pandemic distract us from the urgency of the climate emergency. And let's make sure that our recovery from this is a green recovery. And finally, let's not listen any longer to the siren calls of the populists and the nativists who believe that countries can go it alone and that we have to build a world where we're all in it for ourselves, and recognise that global problems require global solutions and global leaderships through global institutions. And just as the Attlee government rebuilt the fabric of the country through a new welfare state and built international institutions, let us resolve to do the same again.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard some very powerful speeches from members from three parties, and I commend my honourable and right honourable friends for what they have said. And following my honourable friend from Ilford North is quite a challenge, because I think he spoke so powerfully, starting with his own personal experience growing up in the grip of the completely inadequate welfare system we had then. I think the point he made, which really touched me, was just how dangerous it will be if we do not respond to this crisis by putting in place the economic measures that are needed right now, because we run the risk of subjecting millions of our fellow citizens to a very long-term situation of hardship. That is why this is so urgent and needs so much action from government, and as my friend from Leeds West said, only the government can take that action. We face a situation in this country where the figures that I looked at yesterday for the number of fatalities, where we'd got to 69, that had doubled at that stage in 2 days. If that is the rate of growth of the number of fatalities, we will be where Italy is today by next Friday. That is the reality of what is happening if those figures are right. And it brings home to me, and I'm sure to everybody, the need for the fastest possible action on health and also on the economy. And my honourable friend from Ilford North mentioned the need to support health workers, and that applies right across the public service. Number one priority, getting them the protection so they can do their jobs, and making sure that the testing regime is there as quickly as possible. It will not wait any longer. But that is only very closely followed by the economic response that is needed as well. Because if we are to give the reassurance to people across our country to take the action that is recommended by the government, rightly the correct recommendations which the Minister spelled out, then we have to give them the financial assurance that they can take those actions. And it has to happen straight away. The SNP spokesman said in the next few hours, I think, as part of his remarks. He's absolutely right about that. So the measures yesterday are only a start. The Chancellor, I accept, acknowledged they were only one of a number of steps. He's right to say that. But today, as a result of this debate, ministers are hearing further reinforcement of why it is so important that we get the action for individuals today. Not next week, but today. So I will give some case studies. A bus driver in London who believes they have the symptoms of coronavirus, still going to work because sick pay would not be enough money to put food on the table, let alone cover the £1,200 in rent that he pays every week. He can't afford not to work. The reflexologist who works in a care home and is now not able to go to work because she is a visitor. The dog kennel owner who's not going to get any dogs to look after, their income's gone. The tutor who will has lost all of her income. My honourable friend from Leeds West talked about renters. They're often also the most at risk from income loss because of the nature of the work that they're involved in. And can I say that the government needs to support landlords as well as tenants in the private rented sector, as well as supporting social housing landlords at the same time. We've heard reports about rough sleepers being on the tube in London and on public transport elsewhere who are clearly in great distress. The support for people who are outside the system is essential straight away. And at this stage, as far as I can see, it's not in place.
Will the honourable gentleman give way?
Absolutely.
I wonder if the honourable gentleman agrees with me that for lots of the people he is talking about, that yesterday the Chancellor repeatedly said that the measures with regard to universal credit for those who are self-employed, for example, instead of being able to get SSP in this circumstance, is simply not good enough. And today I've had lots of reports of people trying to do that in my constituency, and they are being told by the Department for Work and Pensions that they have to go to a face-to-face meeting, that they have to go through a series of protocols in order to do this, let alone the face-to-face meeting dangers of it. It's simply not the case that these people can get any access to universal credit at the moment.
Well, I thank her for what she said. It reinforces the point. She made the same point in the question she asked the Chancellor yesterday evening, and I just hope ministers are taking on board how quickly this needs to change. One of my constituents made the point who is self-employed, and there is a real problem for 5 million people who are self-employed, who've lost all of their work, that they don't qualify for statutory sick pay. Whether it's universal credit or ESA, it simply isn't anywhere near enough money. He's staying at home observing advice from government, not able to earn his weekly wage, and whatever package from the government that the Minister already referred to, it's nowhere near enough for what they need. Another of my constituents, a nurse, who asked me to raise the situation of principal carers who live with somebody in a vulnerable group. What is the advice and response to her? And the example she gives is her son, who cares for his wife. She has a chronic respiratory disease. She's 26, but with that disease, she is clearly in one of the highest risk groups. Now, she can't work and doesn't leave the house, but what's he supposed to do? He's still going to work with great anxiety because he might catch the disease and pass it on to her. They have a mortgage, they need his income. These are the cases, these are the real-world examples. We've all heard them from our constituents and from others around the country, and they show why the action has to be immediate. And I mentioned the self-employed and freelancers, small firms as well, people on 0 hours contracts. The support just isn't there. £94.25 a week if you're employed and qualify isn't enough. Universal credit isn't enough. There's support announced yesterday for the hospitality and retail sectors for a few weeks is encouraging, but actually what's really needed is the kind of cash injection that a number of my honourable and right honourable friends have already mentioned, and that was put to the Chancellor last night in the questions. Loans are part of the answer, but loans from a banking system that many businesses still don't trust because of the way they behaved during the financial crisis. There's a massive question mark there, and loans have to be repaid. It was the point I made to the Chancellor in the question I asked last night. In reality, we have to avoid storing up problems further down the line in the actions that are taken now. These were very big numbers, eye-catching, headline-grabbing numbers, £330 billion. But the reality is the £10,000 on offer to small firms is not going to last very long as a grant. And then there's the question of information. Now, the Minister mentioned the gov.uk website. Not many businesses, I'm afraid, because I work with them across the country, are aware that that's where to go to get this kind of information. The government needs to do a lot more to get the information out there quickly on a range of these issues, using social media, using the television and radio as well. And the loan system, the grant system for businesses announced yesterday, it appears only to be starting next week. Again, this is so much later than it's really needed. Is there any way of bringing these things forwards? We've heard about the examples in Scandinavia, 75% contribution by the government in Denmark, 90% in Sweden. In Germany, it's 60%, 67% if you've got parental responsibilities. The Minister said these things take time. Why is it that these other countries have been able to put these measures in place so quickly and we're not at that stage yet? What is holding us back, yet they were able to do it? Because it seems to me if they can do it, so can we. So are they looking at what the TUC is saying about a real living wage? At what other members have said about a universal basic income for whatever time-limited period might be right? I tend to agree with my honourable friend from Ilford North on that point. Really, what's needed is a redefinition of what we mean by sick pay, isn't it? Because it's not just whether you're sick, it's whether you're at danger of becoming sick and infecting other people. It's giving that financial reassurance. It's making up for the lost jobs, the livelihoods that are at risk, the contracts that have gone in whatever sector of the economy, and for as long as it takes. If we don't get this right, and only the government can intervene, it will be so much worse for the health of us all, and it will be so much worse for the economy. So the watchword is that the government says they'll do what it takes, whatever it takes. I think that's the three-word slogan of the moment, isn't it? Well, whatever it takes means giving every single person in this country the financial security they need right now to make sure that they can protect themselves, their families and the rest of us.
Richard Fuller.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to you and would like to apologise to the opposition spokesman who spoke first that I missed coming to the chamber the first part of her speech, but I did want to listen and make a contribution, so I appreciate the opportunity, and to thank the opposition for raising this debate, which covers really two of the things that are on most people's minds, which is reducing the likelihood that I will get sick, or anyone in my family will get sick, or anyone I work with will get sick, and if that does happen, that I'm protected, and then trying to protect me in work and my job over the next few weeks, and then my job as we recover. And I think the debate has raised up a number of issues, and I'm not going to pick at any of the ones that have been made, but want to make some observations around that. The first would be what a difference a week has made. It is 7 days since the budget that we had, and this is a very different circumstance. And I think we should give credit to all of the efforts in this House and on the government for the measures that the government has already taken to respond as quickly as it can on such a wide range of issues. None of us in this room have the power of the Almighty, and therefore we should understand that we work within human frailties. And I'll come back to the frailties of our systems we work with in a minute. The second, I'd like to add to some of the examples that were raised earlier on by the SNP spokesman, who I've forgotten, unfortunately, the constituency represent, Adrian Schultz, about the response that the public are making. And for myself this week, I've met with churches who are working on good neighbourhood schemes. I spoke today with a playwright in the village of Alsey who's putting together a group to bring skills together in the community to assist people. We are seeing the best of people, but as some honourable members have mentioned, we're also seeing the worst of people. In a free society, you can see the best, but you can frequently see the worst. Harley Street doctors reselling tests at a high price, which would not be available to others, is a disgraceful thing for anyone with a professional qualification to do. We've seen pictures of the hoarders going into shops so that elderly and vulnerable constituents of mine are not able, and I'm sure everyone else, are not able to access the foodstuffs and others they need. And we've highlighted also some of the reaction of the largest bosses and some of their companies. I think it was Richard... Yes, I will give way for a moment.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. On that point, I have been contacted by a constituent who's informed me that their employer is insisting that they cannot work from home because they say they're waiting for stronger guidance from the government. Can the government offer clear guidance right now to my constituent's employer and many others across the country that if people can be working from home, they must be working at home? Thank you.
I appreciate the honourable lady's intervention, Mr. Speaker. I'm not speaking for the government. I'm sure the Minister will seek to address that. But I have to say, it sounds to me like that your constituent's employer is just making an excuse, because the government has been absolutely clear that it is the right thing to do socially for everyone in this country to, if they have a concern, to be able to isolate themselves from others and to work from home. I mean, what more does that person need to understand what they should do? And hopefully that will get the message very clearly from the front bench. But to the point of leaders not doing the right thing, I think the experience of Virgin Airlines has been raised, that the owner or partial owner of Virgin Airlines has suggested they should take 8 weeks of unpaid leave. And I decided, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to look and see how much would that cost. Well, 8 weeks at the £94 statutory sick pay would cost £754 per employee. There are 8,571 employees in Virgin Airlines. So if all of them took 8 weeks unpaid leave, that would be a cost of £6.4 million. Sir Richard Branson's net worth is $3.8 billion. If he's able to get 2% interest on that money for 8 weeks, he will earn the equivalent of £9.9 million. So I say, Sir Richard Branson, give up your interest on your wealth for 8 weeks and pay your employees yourself their unpaid leave. Big or small, in a small village, a leader of a church, or a leader of a large business, when it comes to looking at the protection of your workers, the time is now, and we will judge you all by your actions. And the same will be for the government's actions. And I say that, sorry, very logically, are we choosing the right policies? And we've heard a lot about that today. I would congratulate the government on the staging of the announcements. There's so much pressure. All MPs are under pressure. Loads of questions, small, micro ones and very large ones that cover many. But I think the staging of announcements is a good approach, because we need it to bed into people each day. If we put everything into a single-day announcement, I would worry that although we would feel we were communicating out, the government find that the understanding is not being received as clearly as it should.
Will you give way?
I shall.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I commend his speech thus far. And to some extent, I agree that for preparedness, for working through particular policies of intervention, that there has to be some preparation, and that does take time. But in terms of people's livelihoods, people are losing their jobs now. Businesses are making decisions about their future viability now. So would you encourage the government, like I have, for an announcement to be made about the financial impetus that can be made to protect individuals and jobs in hours and not days, so that this response could be adequate?
Yes, and yes, which is the yeses for each of the businesses in the last 24 hours that I've spoken with in my constituency, who asked precisely for that. We often think, how can a business suddenly be short of money to pay its own workers within a short period of time? But the truth of the matter is, in some sectors, cash flow is of a nature that those issues do come up. And more importantly, I would say to my front bench, every single responsible private sector business right now, first and foremost, will be thinking, how can I protect cash flow for the long-term survival of my business? And one of the nearest shortest-term costs that can be reduced is your employee cost. And so there is this sort of sense that there is a need, as the honourable member rightly says, of in hours rather than days. And I think if we're fair, the Chancellor was very aware of that in his statement yesterday. And to that point, can I just encourage honourable members on both sides, I think there's slightly more on the opposition side than perhaps on this side for certain reasons, to think more about using what is already in place, the systems that we have that connect what the government can do to those institutions and people who need it, rather than trying to broaden out into a big and different debate about should we have this or should we have not. There is, of course, a time for debating about universal income. There is time for us to think about ways in which we might look at a better overall system in the future. But right now, I think proposals, if I can say to my friends on the front bench, proposals that use the existing arteries of the financial system, arteries of the benefit system, arteries of the PAYE and tax system that can reach people are what we should be looking either to amplify payments that are already made or to reverse flows from being once into the government to being back out to those who need it. Please do not, front bench, please do not get too distracted by items along the way. I do think we should also recognise that there will be in this period a test for the labour market structure in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom does have some, not quite unique, but quite nuanced features, particularly its reliance on flexible working, its reliance on self-employment, where the changes that governments have put in over the last 15 years to create what is a flexible market, and there are benefits for that, will also be tested in this period where there is this pause in the economy. And I would encourage the government, after we have gone through this particular crisis, to look and see what lessons have been learned from that. And also, it is a question about a test for us in terms of the enlightenment we have on our social insurance system. I was moved by some of the contributions by the Honourable Lady, I think is the member for Leeds West, the chair of the Business Select Committee, and the Honourable Member for the constituency in London, whose name I've also got terrible memory. Yeah. The speakers would correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely right. This is an opportunity for us to look at those items and to reflect. We may have different perspectives on that. We will definitely have different politics on it. But the need for us to look at this and to learn lessons, I think only a fool would say that we should not do that. And this is no time for fools. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I could just in closing say, the core message I would say to the government is, I think that the staging of announcements is absolutely right so it can bed in with people. Use the existing systems that we have to get money into the hands of the people and the businesses who need it, and follow the advice on all sides of the House, which we would welcome you moving with the speed of the time from the announcement to the time that that is available in that bank manager's office in Arlesey or in Bolnhurst or anywhere else in the country, or in that person's pay packet, or in their bank account, or in their benefit slip that they get.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank actually the member for North East Bedfordshire, who has been uniquely brave to speak from the backbench on his side, and I think there was much that I think that we could all on our side agree with him about. The scale of the coronavirus crisis means you take action in many forms, and ensuring people have economic security is second only to our response in terms of safeguarding people's health. The point will come when we have mass isolation. I feel that point is probably coming very soon, and that will be whether people are symptomatic or not. This unprecedented challenge needs an unprecedented response, and we must work together and bring forward the right response that safeguards people and brings future confidence, not just immediate well-being. A measure that will do just that is an emergency universal basic income, which will give everyone the basic financial support they need to provide the necessities of everyday life through this crisis. My honourable friend from Ilford North, who has just left, made some very good points. That in normal circumstances, this might be a debate where we have questions, where we explore different aspects, where we talk about particularly on our side of the House, about the benefits of universal basic income against universal basic services. I might suggest to the government actually that if we had universal basic services in areas such as childcare and social care, we'd be in a much better place to weather this crisis than having just a single universal basic service, the National Health Service, which is taking the brunt of the crisis. But taking that aside and thinking about where we are and where we're about to enter in the phase of the coronavirus crisis, I think taking this step is necessary. We just need to think about how our economy has changed fundamentally since 2008, with the number of self-employed having risen over the past 15 years from 3.25 million people to more than 5 million people. These people can only properly be protected through a universal basic income, as well as those who are going to lose their employment very sadly, either through redundancy, through temporary lack of work, through the businesses failing and closing because of the crisis. Let's think about the app-based driver, the 0 hours warehouse worker, the children's entertainer, the agency-supplied care worker, none of whom have an employer. The government can incentivise by keeping them in work. A universal basic income will be more holistic and more effective than subsidising company payroll, which seems to be the government's main tool at the moment in dealing with the crisis. Finally, I'd like to just for a moment look across the Atlantic to the United States of America. Normally on this side of the House, we don't look to the United States of America. But actually, just yesterday, the US Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, said that cash infusions could happen swiftly. We're looking at sending cheques to Americans immediately. Well, this sounds very much like a temporary universal basic income to me. Andrew Yang, the former Democratic contender for the president, said that there should be introduced well before this crisis a universal basic income of $1,000 a month. He is now speaking directly to the White House. Donald Trump himself said, I think we're going to have to do something that gets money to them as quickly as possible. This is the measure which will get money straight into people and give them that basic economic security. And what I would say to the front bench, if Yang and Trump can work together, surely so can Sunak and McDonnell. Thank you.
Matt Rhoda.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to speak in today's important debate. I would like to start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West, and many other speakers, including the member for North West Bedfordshire, who spoke very eloquently about this issue, and indeed the member for Ilford North, who I think made some very thoughtful and far-sighted points. I would like to address not just the policy responses which we need, but the underlying scale of the problem. And we've heard today how as many as 5.5 million people are self-employed in this country. I want to describe my experience of that as a constituency MP, but also set it in the context of the wider crisis which we face. Mr Deputy Speaker, we do face an unprecedented situation, and I fully acknowledge the action that the government has taken. Measures to reduce the spread of the outbreak are vital, and I'm pleased that the ministers have now announced robust measures this week, and that includes the measures they announced yesterday to support businesses. However, the point I would like to make in my short speech today is that I want that action to go much further and to be much more resolute because of the scale and need of people in work who work for themselves and indeed who are on low incomes or in the gig economy. I support the range of measures that my honourable friend, the member for Wirral West, outlined earlier, and I would like to draw the Minister's attention in particular to the approach taken in Scandinavia and by a number of other European governments. We have mention of the Irish government here today as well. The government now needs to rapidly develop a comprehensive approach, a safety net for all workers and indeed all renters who are uniquely vulnerable in the current crisis. And I'd like to highlight what this means to local people in Reading and Woodley, the area that I represent. Self-employed people are the absolute bedrock of our local economy on a whole range of, carrying out a whole range of activity, both in the knowledge economy, public services, other forms of service, retail, distribution. So to just start, I would like to highlight the role and the importance in our local economy of IT subcontractors. We have some of the largest IT businesses in the world based in our part of the Thames Valley. Those large businesses subcontract to many, many smaller businesses. Most of those are one-woman or one-man bands who are very dependent on a relatively unstable economic situation. We also, as a growing and rapidly expanding area close to London and the Midlands, have a large amount of construction taking place. We have many small builders and other tradespeople who are dependent on jobs and on work which is relatively short term. They may only see a few weeks ahead economically. We also have a vibrant transport sector with a large number of people employed in the aviation industry at Heathrow. We have many taxi drivers and many people who work on the railways, all part of a transport sector which looks set to be severely constrained because of the crisis. Indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, we're also the main shopping town for the southern part of, for the Thames Valley and the related parts of the South Midlands. And we also have a very vibrant gig economy with a number of distribution centres and warehouses nearby. This group of people, at the same time, and many of them are also renters, so we have a double hit in our local economy. On the one hand, many people who are vulnerable because they have only one guaranteed month's income ahead going forward, whether they are professional people, people with trades, or people who have other skills. But we also have the same group of people, many of them young families, living in rented accommodation, which is very high cost, in an area which is similar in cost to outer London or the centre of a major city around Britain. And I would like to draw the Minister's attention to this local example, which I believe reflects many towns and cities across the country, where you have this collision and reinforcement happening between, on the one hand, people's incomes are insecure and who are vulnerable and who haven't yet had their situation addressed by the government's measures, however helpful those measures will be to larger businesses, and they are also renters in a high-cost local rental economy, where rental income can be as much as £1,000 for a month for a basic accommodation. So the issue now, Mr Deputy Speaker, is to take action and to take it urgently, and I would ask the Minister to reconsider the government's approach, focus on the needs of these groups of workers and renters, think about the world from their perspective, where their income is not guaranteed, it's very vulnerable. They are the bedrock of the local economy in so many parts of our country, and indeed for the country as a whole. They deserve our support and our respect. And to come up with a plan, a realistic and workable plan, using whatever policy measures are necessary to protect them and their family income and to ensure their safety and security. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister if he's seen the proposals from the Communication Workers Union yesterday, which called for Royal Mail to act effectively as a fourth emergency service at the current time. It is the only organisation in the country that puts workers on every single street, 6 days a week, and postal workers are trusted in every community. Whether it is delivering prescriptions, or food bank parcels, or checking on elderly people who might need support, particularly if care services cannot be provided to them. There is an important role Royal Mail could play if appropriate precautions are taken. Will he join me in paying tributes to the union, and does the Minister agree with me that this should be explored as a matter of urgency, and will he commit to speak to the Communication Workers Union and Royal Mail to discuss this? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak in this very important debate today. It's difficult to follow such powerful speeches and such great orators who have made their points so eloquently, so I will be brief, but I make no apology for reiterating the points we need the Government to act on now. Statutory sick pay will now be available for eligible individuals diagnosed with COVID-19 or those who are unable to work because they are self-isolating in line with government advice. And it's right to commend the Government for their actions of making SSP available on day 1 instead of day 4 for affected individuals. However, at this time of intense worry and strife, it's also right to highlight where the Government must act to help those who need it. Mr Deputy Speaker, statutory sick pay is £94.25 a week. We've already heard this. The equivalent weekly payment on the national minimum wage is £307.88. How can the UK government justify forcing potentially millions of people to live on under a third of their usual weekly income? The Chancellor himself stumbled when asked if he could afford to live on that sum, and I would implore colleagues across the House to ask themselves the same question: could they? The UK Government's COVID-19 advice on their gov.uk website on statutory sick pay is only a total of 13 lines, but universal credit is mentioned 3 times. This is important that the Government seeks to ensure those who are not eligible for SSP or those who are self-employed are aware that they can claim for universal credit. Well, that's fine, but I and my colleagues have spoken numerous times in this place of the difficulties inherent within the universal credit system. In this instance, I wish to specifically raise the fact that application must be made online and that claimants wait a period of 5 weeks for their first payment. I want to ask the Minister what steps the Government are taking to assist those who are not able to leave their homes, but who are also unable to access the web, so they may apply for the benefit. Furthermore, what steps is the Government taking to ensure new universal credit claimants who are self-isolating, some for periods of up to 16 weeks, do not have to wait 5 weeks for their first payment? Alternatively, will the Government consider extending the period over which advance payments must be repaid? The UK Government will refund SSP for small employers, those who employ under 250 people. This refund, however, will only cover up to 2 weeks SSP per eligible employee who has been off work because of COVID-19. How can the Government reconcile this with its current advice that some employees will have to self-isolate for up to 16 weeks? With thousands of local and independent businesses already scared for their continued existence, can the Government reconsider this policy and offer SSP refunds for the total period of time that employees are required to claim during this crisis? I do appreciate these are unknown and challenging times, but I urge the Government to consider people who are falling through the SSP safety net and to act quickly and compassionately now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We conclude this debate on statutory sick pay and protection for workers at a time of immense uncertainty, as we are witnessing an implosion in our labour market and people's lives being turned upside down. As we have long feared, those in the most insecure work have little resilience to weather this storm, and as we speak, thousands of people are being laid off, are falling into hardship and are fearful for their future. We cannot let the story of coronavirus also be one about avoidable poverty. So today, Labour is highlighting how government must take a far more robust approach to create the safety net that all must need. Government has said that no one should be penalised for doing the right thing, yet without stronger and highlighting how they had now become the front line of healthcare, and yet only had a tiny stock of plastic pennies, gloves and masks. Tradeswomen and men, like plumbers, will need to carry out urgent home repairs. They will need protection. And care staff need provided PPE, not expected to pay for them themselves. But also workers must never feel that they have to choose between health, their own and that of others, and hardship. And even after yesterday's announcement, they were offered little comfort. 3 things on SSP and isolation leave pay, and if I may, add family and carers leave too. First, no worker should be excluded from statutory sick pay protection or sickness or isolation. No matter employment status, employee, worker, the self-employed, office holder or LIMBE workers. No matter what you earn, which is why the lower earnings limit must go. No matter if you have already taken 28 weeks statutory sick pay or not. All who work should have statutory pay protection for sickness and isolation from day one. If people are required to stay away from work or are staying away to protect their health due to existing underlying health conditions, they should not be penalised, nor should their family members, as my honourable friend, the member for Sefton Central, set out. Life must come first. We further need these measures to reach beyond the narrow application of coronavirus. People will be isolating who have had signs but maybe not the virus. Vulnerable people are at risk from all commutable diseases, and therefore the application of these measures needs to apply to all sickness and isolation absences. While many companies are establishing full pay for those sick and in isolation, others aren't. This inequality must be addressed. Universal credit is no substitute, as my honourable friends, the member for East Ham and Newport West, highlighted with their experience. And we have heard in the debate it pays even less than SSP and takes 5 weeks to process. And I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for East Ham, who set out, of course, the plight of those who have no recourse to public funds. That must be resolved. Simple changes to Health and Safety at Work Act, Section 16, and the Employment Rights Act 1996, Section 64, would ensure that all workers were fairly remunerated and not experience hardship. With the underpinning of statutory sick pay, UK workers would be protected to levels as we are seeing elsewhere. As life must come first, to reduce a worker to poverty, levels of statutory sick pay at just 18.4% of the average wage will not be sufficient for those who are forced to make a choice between health and hardship. We cannot afford for anyone to go out to work if the determination is that they should isolate or are sick. But if they are battling to keep their head above water financially, they may lessen the severity of their sickness to justify just to themselves that they are not really a risk. At a time when other countries are significantly raising their statutory sick pay, the UK, which pays the lowest rate of statutory sick pay than the other EU 27 countries, must now ensure that statutory sick pay provides vital protection. The TUC has highlighted how the real living wage is the right benchmark when full pay is not paid. Many in today's debate across the House, including my honourable friends to Leeds North West and Ilford North, have also highlighted the opportunities a universal basic income would provide. And the Prime Minister earlier said that he is willing to look at that and must. In the light of the possible scale and duration of isolation and sickness expected to be taken, the £1 billion package announced by the Chancellor is totally insufficient. Will the Secretary of State return to the House this week and confirm that she will, through a poverty prevention measure, ensure that statutory sick pay is paid to take away the additional fear of financial hardship so people will be able to pay their rent, bills and for fuel and food? Without the significant shift, people will be dependent on other sources of income support, perhaps the food bank and other charitable support. However, we know that these are areas in themselves experiencing major challenges at this time. The infrastructure to underpin this is completely avoidable. Completely avoidable poverty is so fragile, so statutory pay must rise. Third, parents and carers are also facing new challenges as they are having to significantly change their lives. No one should be denied the right to meet family and carer needs at such a time as this. Will the Secretary of State ensure that taking leave for family emergencies and for care provision become a right, not a right to ask, but a right to get, and people remain fully remunerated for doing so? While most employers will be accommodating, this is a critical time, and we need to ensure all parents and carers are supported in this national effort. I further want to raise the issue of pace. While welcoming the Chancellor's announcement that he will work with trade unions and businesses to provide wage protection, this needs resolving now, this week. If countries like Denmark have brought forward a scheme of wage protection, then there is no need to reinvent the wheel, but deliver a scheme through the emergency legislation being laid tomorrow. As the Honourable Member for Leeds West said, if it is good enough for workers in other countries, it is good enough here. Denmark's first case of coronavirus was on the 27th of February. New Zealand's first case on the 28th of February. And they have developed and delivered support already. The UK's first case was on the 31st of January. and we still have nothing to protect people's incomes. People are losing their jobs now, and it could be avoided. It must be avoided. Employers need confidence that the government will deliver a package of wage substitution. Workers need confidence that they will not face poverty. We need interventions now so that jobs can be saved. Many workers, where there is a cessation of work through this critical crisis, may step up in the national effort to provide vital services elsewhere in the economy, for instance in health and care. For doing the right thing, can the Secretary of State ensure that their position in their substantive jobs are protected when they return, like someone returning from maternity leave, that they will be able to return to the job they left? At this point, I also endorse my honourable friend for Stockport in highlighting the extended role that others can play, for instance, postal workers, and I do urge the government to meet with the CWU and to explore that terrain further. The last few days has exposed the weaknesses in zero-hour contracts. Workers reduced to 0 hours and yet must still be available to work. They are desperate. 1.87 million workers will therefore not qualify for statutory sick pay. 70% of these are women. I'm asking the Secretary of State to end this insecurity in work. All workers need security, not least at a time such as this. Will she therefore move to ensure that all employment becomes substantive? Workers are placed on proper contracts and it is underpinned by the same securities afforded to all employees. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, may I reinforce workers and employers are being called upon to take extraordinary steps to protect our country from the worst aspects of COVID-19. They need a government which recognises all the challenges they face and will provide the full protection that they need. The Chancellor promised to do this, so will the Secretary of State ensure that all the holes that continue to exist in the safety net are closed by the publication of the emergency legislation and workers now get the support they need to save them from hardship? All these things are political choices. Making the right call today may save us from the worst aspects of an economic crisis and reset the dial for a fairer and more equitable country to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And firstly, let me thank all members from across the House who've taken time to attend this very important debate and to speak about their concerns in such a constructive and collaborative way. And I will try to answer as many of the numerous points that have been raised. But what I would stress, Mr Deputy Speaker, as honourable members from across this House know, my door is always open, my phone is always on, and when you do have urgent cases, please do reach out to me and other ministers on the Treasury bench, and we will look to take the appropriate action as necessary. As my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, made clear yesterday, we will do whatever it takes to support people, to support jobs, to support businesses, and to help people to protect their loved ones. This includes the measures we are taking on statutory sick pay to ensure that everybody is supported to do the right thing and to follow the government advice on self-isolation. We must come together to fight this virus and protect the most vulnerable, and statutory sick pay is part of our welfare safety net and our wider government offer to support people in times of need. And that is why we're making sure that our welfare safety net provides the right level of support in these exceptional times. We've extended statutory sick pay to those who are self-isolating, in line with the latest government health guidance, and the upcoming emergency bill will make statutory sick pay payable from day 1 instead of day 4. This is the right thing to do to ensure that eligible individuals are supported to stay at home in self-isolation, protecting themselves and others. As my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, set out, this government will stand behind businesses both large and small. As a DWP minister, I know that the best way to support people is through protecting their jobs. Small and medium businesses are the backbone of our economy, and we will support them to implement these measures. Employers with fewer than 250 employees will be able to reclaim up to 2 weeks statutory sick pay, paid for sickness absences relating to the coronavirus, a measure which could help up to 2 million businesses. These changes will help to provide certainty and security for individuals and businesses affected by coronavirus. Mr Deputy Speaker, statutory sick pay is just one of the government's offer of support and protection. The safety net also extends to those who are self-employed or who work in the gig economy. Workers on 0 hours contracts or in the gig economy may be eligible for sick pay and should check with their employers. But those who aren't eligible, we are here to support them, and they can make a claim for universal credit or contributory employment and support allowance. Last week, we made changes so that the 7 waiting days for employment and support allowance for new claimants affected by coronavirus or required to self-isolate will not apply. This means it is payable from day 1 without the need to provide medical evidence and without the need to attend a work capability assessment. Those required to self-isolate or ill with coronavirus can receive up to a month's advance from day 1, with no need to physically attend a job centre, a point raised by the honourable gentleman opposite. Any individuals affected by coronavirus will have their work search and work availability requirements switched off, and affected self-employed claimants will not have a minimum income floor applied during this period. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, a number of points have been raised, specific points in this debate, and I will try to cover as many as possible. The Honourable Member for Sefton Central raised the very important point about communication of changes. Everything is on gov.uk. Government departments also use social media to highlight this, including social media such as Twitter. Now, there are also daily press conferences from the Prime Minister, often now more increasingly accompanied by another member of the Cabinet who will give updates on coronavirus. But I do take his point that communications in times like this are incredibly important, and I will certainly feed it back to the Cabinet Office that where improvements can be made to government communications, and in particular for businesses, which is the point the Honourable Member made, then I will of course make that case to the Cabinet Office. The point about statutory... Yes, of course I will.
I'm grateful for that answer, and I know he will do his best to carry out what he just promised. But can he also make sure that that information comes to us and to local authorities as well in a timely fashion, as very often we're in a position to get it out to a great number of people in a short space of time?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for making that case, and I know from my own postbag and email account that a number of businesses and individuals affected who are either concerned on health grounds or about their employment or financial status will contact their Member of Parliament. We are often not always the first port of call, but sometimes the last, but one where people expect to be able to get a response and quickly. So I will look at what further guidance and advice we can give to members of this House and through local authorities, and that point may well have been heard because the relevant minister is in fact just sitting on the Treasury bench just behind me to get that message out to local authorities. The Honourable Lady Member for Newport West raised the point about statutory sick pay and the rebate for employees and whether that could be for more than 2 weeks. The current, I understand the point that she's making. The current government advice is for people to self-isolate for 7 days or for 14 days if in a household. So therefore we do feel the 2-week limit on rebate is a proportionate response. The Honourable Lady also raised the point about why statutory sick pay is not at the same rate as the living wage. And the current system is designed to balance support for the individual with the costs to the employer. And we have put, as my honourable friend, the member for Swindon North, mentioned at the beginning of this debate, £1 billion into the welfare system to provide additional financial security for people. And people with low income can get a top-up where applicable through universal credit. And numerous honourable members, I think the member for Sefton Central and Leeds West, both raised a point about members in the private rented sector. And at the Prime Minister's questions today, the Prime Minister did say that we will be bringing forward legislation to protect private renters from eviction, and the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government are considering whether we need to go further on that point. The honourable gentleman, the member for East Ham and the member for Airdrie and Shotts both raised a point about the consultation on the lower earning limit. Now, our immediate concern in dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak, Mr Deputy Speaker, is to ensure that there is a suitable financial safety net in place, and the benefit system does provide that. And we estimate that around 60% of people earning below the lower earning limit are already in receipt of benefits. Now, our longer-term aim in that consultation was about preserving the link between the employer and the employee so that the individual receives appropriate support on return to work. Now, that is less relevant when most people are facing very short periods away from work. So I'd be very happy to meet with the honourable gentleman or will the Minister for Disabled People at a later point to discuss that further. The numerous honourable members also raised the point about why we're focusing, the focus so far has been on businesses and not just about individuals. Now, precisely so, organisations, it's so important that they are able to carry on trading, and that's why the initial focus of Her Majesty's Treasury has been to support business and to keep people in work where it is sensible and appropriate based on government guidance to do so, because that does ultimately protect so many individuals in our society. But of course we are also looking at other measures for workers. The Honourable Lady, the member for Newcastle upon Tyne Central, and the Honourable Member for East Ham and Airdrie and Shotts all raised the point about raising the level of statutory sick pay. We are continuing to look at other support for workers to see what best mechanisms are available, and thankfully a period of absence is likely to be short, so we believe between 7 and 14 days. But we know that some, and I know this has been raised by honourable members across the Chamber, may need extra support. We know low-paid workers are likely to be receiving additional support through universal credit, for example, and the advantage of universal credit is it will go up if income falls to the equivalent SSP level. Yes, of course I will.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way and for addressing the points that honourable members have made this afternoon. It is true that you won't have to take that long off to self-isolate for your recovery, but overall there's likely to be a suppression of demand in the economy for a longer period of time. Absolutely. So the idea that people may only be off at work for 1 or 2 weeks, that's fine if it's for health reasons, but if it's because their business is closed or there's just not work available, it's likely to be a lot longer, and that's the point that many members are trying to make this afternoon.
Yeah, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for making that point. I mean, what I want to do, Mr Deputy Speaker, is to reassure members that the government is doing all that it can to ensure that everybody is supported to do the right thing. It's crucial that everyone follows the government guidance on self-isolation. That's been clear throughout this debate, to protect both themselves and also others. And the measures we have announced and will put forward in the emergency bill will support people to do so. But to come directly to the point the Honourable Lady makes, the Chancellor has announced that in the coming days this government will go much further to support people's financial security, working with trade unions, another point that's been raised by the Honourable Gentleman opposite, and businesses to urgently develop new forms of employment support to help protect people's jobs and incomes through this period. And I know the Honourable Lady would like to tempt me to go further. I think she'd understand that is somewhat above my pay grade, but it's very important that debates like this do take place, because the debate this afternoon will have been heard by Her Majesty's Treasury and will be taken in the spirit of working collaboratively on a cross-party basis. And I certainly take those ideas, and if people have further ideas about how we can better support some of the most vulnerable people in our society, then, as I say, my door is always open and I would welcome people coming forward with those. The Honourable Gentleman, the Chairman of the Select Committee, raised the point about the habitual residence test, and I will take this away and give it some further thought. The habitual resident test has operational procedures already in place to expedite confirmation of eligibility, but I will take this away and give this further thought. It's not a consideration I had given prior to him raising it, and I'd be very happy to meet with him to discuss it further. Mr Deputy Speaker, we have a safety net that helps people facing hardship if they cannot work or are seeking work. And depending on their individual circumstances, employees can claim universal credit and or New Style, ESA or JSA. And as the Prime Minister set out, this government will keep everything under review. The package set out at the budget and the new measures recently announced should give some reassurance that support will be provided to support jobs, income and businesses. And as the Chancellor said, we will do whatever it takes. Mr Deputy Speaker, we are in extraordinary times. The coronavirus pandemic is the most serious public health emergency that our nation has faced for a generation. Our policy is to protect lives and fight this virus with everything we have. And this government has been clear in its approach. We will do whatever it takes to get the nation through these testing times. We will protect people, their jobs and businesses through this period to ensure that we keep as many people as safe as possible.
Question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the second opposition day motion on local government responsibilities for public.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.